Chapter 935. Luonan had completed a brilliant early warning. This was the specialty of the mental side, but it wasn't easy to do in the current situation. It was difficult to release soul strength into the void, and it could be wantonly extended. Luonan was able to deduce the corresponding signs from the details of the conflicting laws of the three sides. Then he captured the corresponding target. The pterosaur army was mobilized by the magnetic mica jellyfish regardless of the cost. They forcefully broke through the blockade and made a suicidal attack in the direction of the blocking position. Some of them displayed the characteristics of the assault beetles. When their broken bodies swept past the canyon area at low altitude, they brought with them raging flames. Every time they spat out acid bombs, they would also catalyze the most insidious flames. It was like a rapid rain of fire that was blown by the wind, pouring down on the defensive line. The outer cabin of the freezing device was still at the outer edge of the fortress. Of course, it was within the range of the rain of fire. However, the damage of the rain of fire was dealt with by the defensive system of the blocking position. Luonan didn't need to worry about it. From his perspective, there was nothing more realistic than the fact that his early warning still had some errors in a relatively higher level domain. Earlier than the pterosaur air raid, a heavy magnetic spirit hammer fell from the sky. It was a powerful attack from the main body of the magnetic mica jellyfish. Luonan wasn't clear on the specific mechanism of the magnetic spirit hammer, but he was able to observe and sense the surrounding laws and environment the moment this strike fell. It was as if he had been struck by a stun grenade. All order was distorted and turbulent. This caused a considerable negative effect on the defensive system of the blocking position. This was clearly a targeted method of the magnetic mica jellyfish. However, who could be more brilliant than the other in a prolonged confrontation? The Bloodshed Land had many contingency plans to deal with this situation. After a short period of shock, the entire outer wall of the fortress lit up with pure light. This layer of light was a bit similar to the format of fire. In fact, it was the representation of a myriad of preset configurations that circulated and switched and reassembled. It formed an effect close to an energy shield. It blocked a large portion of the most destructive and corrosive of the rain of fire. At the same time, it suppressed the warping power of the mad magnetic spirit hammer. The two sides went back and forth, calmly dealing with each other. It was quite marvelous. Luonan originally loved this sort of scene the most. However, his energy had declined and he had a headache. He really had a headache. The confrontation between the two sides had escalated, and the intensity had increased. This meant that the flow of information, which had been relatively flat before, had suddenly risen to a new level. And it wasn't just one level, but several levels. Countless variables were added in the blink of an eye within Luonan's range of perception. It involved the immediate responses of the Bloodshed Land, the magnetite mica jellyfish, and the Hellfire Tyrant. Even if the Hellfire Tyrant could be ignored for the time being, the scale of the first two changes was no different from a nuclear bomb explosion in terms of information volume. And they all involved Luonan's current observations. They all touched upon the domain that Luonan was still in. The changes brought about more references. Luonan could see more, but he also had to bear more. The water level of his energy dropped again. Luonan didn't even have the strength to stand against the wall. It was also at this moment that he finally understood. Apart from the benefits of the flow of time inside and outside, which had to be built on a foundation of high consumption, wasn't the Interverse Simulator's analysis, deduction, and simulation of high-level laws the same? The wool comes from the sheep's back. In the end, wouldn't Luonan have to support all the expenses alone? A large-scale conflict of this scale involved two sovereign-level fantasy breeds, as well as the bloodshed domain framework of the same level. The simulation of the three high-level laws needed to be synchronized. The Interverse Simulator, which was Luonan, really could not hold on any longer. Luonan. This was Lieutenant Shangmin's call. The changed environment of the rules had caused a few variables to appear in the work of the transfer, which was practically set in stone. This was within her expectations, but Luo Nan, who had always been quick-witted, was clearly slower by half a beat when it came to debugging the transfer equipment. She had no choice but to be sensitive. "How are you?" The question was superfluous, but it reflected the change in Lieutenant Xiang Min's attitude toward Luo Nan. Hearing Xiang Min's call, Luo Nan struggled out of his trance of energy exhaustion. Without any hesitation, he activated the strengthening element storage inside the exoskeleton armor and completed the injection. But he could guess the result. It was probably meaningless. Sure enough, even though Luo Nan's physical strength instantly exploded in this host within the game scene, the soul strength supporting the operation had already been extracted from its roots, consumed. How could it be so easy to replenish? Luckily, Luo Nan already knew how to deal with it. He withdrew most of his scattered telepathic senses and forced himself to stop pondering over the high-level evolution laws of the bloodshed land and the magneto-optical mica. He only kept the necessary links to deal with the current work. Though his energy reserves did not improve, they no longer worsened. Luo Nan could finally catch his breath. "Are the strengthening elements effective?" Xiang Min asked another useless question. "Yes." Luo Nan was a man of few words. "Then continue." Xiang Min pretended not to see Luo Nan's weak and trembling legs. She chose to continue trusting the young maintenance soldier in front of her. Luo Nan also chose to accept this trust. Even though his current state was terrible, he was barely able to maintain the necessary pressure transfer channel. He gathered his limited energy and observed the state of the equipment. He was already at his limit. It was already fortunate that he did not make any mistakes. He really didn't have much time here. Luo Nan didn't calculate the specific amount of energy he had left. He could only concentrate on the matter in front of him. He didn't have the leisure to pay attention to the pterosaur assault group that had already flown above his head and had begun their suicidal attack. Half of the freezing device had already extended into the transfer port. The other transfer vehicle that was already parked inside Microji 06 had already begun its docking. Success was at hand, but he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Lieutenant Xiang Min entered Luo Nan's eyes and ears. There was also information coming from various directions. Luo Nan wasn't able to understand much of it, and he was unable to delve into the meaning within. He treated it as pure garbage information, allowing it to flash by. After a few flashes, Luo Nan's extremely limited energy made it hard for him to continue with the specific mechanical structure and debugging work. So he tossed away the burden once more. His field of focus was completely locked on the configuration level. He ensured that the structure of this area was maintained within a reasonable range. The buzzing flying ants were still fluttering within the cabin, representing Luo Nan's remaining vitality. It was through this medium that he was able to correct the errors in the material plane. Luo Nan chose the method he was best at in his weakest moment. How could he have the strength to judge whether or not this method of work was truly labor-saving and whether or not it conformed to the norms of the drill manual? In any case, Go Yi and Xianzhu didn't stop him, right? If things continued like this, he could still persevere. He could persevere. F***CK. Earth's characteristic curse words sprayed out from Luo Nan's mouth, but they were so vague that even he couldn't hear them clearly. They were just a small stimulant that gave his dazed consciousness a fierce stab. This was because at this moment a new power of rule, a power that was different from the bloodshed domain, the magnetic mica jellyfish, and the inferno tyrant, spread out from the depths of the void. Luo Nan didn't know where its source was due to the contraction of his perception, but this rule was far too unique. It could be said to be a rule, but it was more like a natural crack in the depths of the void. With just a slight vibration, it suddenly split open. The void split open, and everything it carried changed along with it. The The bloodshed domain looked weak, because it wasn't facing the forceful tearing and explosive attack of the Inferno tyrant. Instead, it was being dissected like a butcher dismembering an ox. The new power of rule didn't even touch the strict barrier of the bloodshed domain. Instead, it directly tore apart the foundation it relied on. The space-time structure of the bloodshed domain certainly had its own system of rules. But in the face of this kind of destruction that was infinitely close to primordial, the tightness of the rules simply didn't have enough time to display its effect. Cracks had already appeared. This kind of crack was irregular. It was like lightning striking down on a rainy day. Every branch and every trajectory was different. No one knew where the crack would lead to. Luonan and Lieutenant Shangmin were the more unlucky ones. Noiselessly, the rear area of the outer cabin of the freezing device was cut in half. The invisible blade practically brushed past the back of Shangmin's and Luonan's heads and the tips of their noses. In reality, there was no such coincidence. It was just that Luonan had dozens of syncopators, acting as guides and scapegoats. At this time, if the new power of rule continued to display its primordial effect, it was not impossible for the affected area of the bloodshed domain to fall apart. But at this moment, it was hard for this new special power of rule to maintain its primordial purity. Instead, it produced some sort of chemical reaction with the current spacetime environment. A fuzzy silhouette grew rapidly. It was as if the main body, hidden in the ruptured spacetime gap, had jumped out. Another sovereign-level fantasy breed? Luonan only caught a glimpse of a fuzzy shadow. His judgment wasn't right or wrong. Luonan had sensed the series of changes mentioned above. It was very clear and complete. After all, this was the domain he was most proficient in. The problem was that Luonan was willing to be blind. Luonan had clearly blocked it, but the clear information of the changes in the void was still deeply engraved. It added more variables to the complicated situation of the three parties entangled together. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. He really couldn't hold on any longer. Luonan saw himself in a deep sleep state once more. Earlier, he saw Her Majesty Empress Wu's private airship, a projection of water vapor that had exploded and dispersed. Yes, in the real world, the soul cloak that had originally covered the entire world was rapidly shrinking. It was no longer enough to support the consumption of several thousand kilometers. From the current situation, the consumption was simply shocking. The barrier between the game scene and the real world had become exceptionally weak at this moment. It seemed that Luonan just needed to fall back and he would fall out from the boundary between the two, realizing his return. It was at this time that he heard Lieutenant Goyi yell in the channel. Shadow Cockroach. Chapter 936. Shadow Cockroach? Luonan should have seen this name or a similar name in the database related to the Outer Realm species. However, he no longer had the space to recall. He was unable to make a further reaction. His energy had already been squandered on the support and analysis of the high-level evolution of the laws. He had a bit of energy left over to deal with the killing move of the shadow cockroach that sliced through the void. He had indeed blocked the first wave of death. The dozens of syncopators on the ground had already turned to slag. They had blocked the disaster in place of Luonan, Lieutenant Shangmin, and Sir Yuan. But the second wave... Luonan watched helplessly as the shadow cockroach's main body appeared in the void. It was just like an extended wraith. It wanted to swallow the freezing device, the outer cabin, and the three people involved in the critical moment of the connection in one gulp. A powerful light exploded in this area at this moment. Fortunately, Luonan was wearing a full helmet and a metal visor. The light particles were filtered, and Luonan's eyes only blurred for an instant. Then the panoramic simulation's field of vision was restored to normal. There was just a bit of thermal noise brought about by the powerful light. Most importantly, there was still a bit missing. Shangmin's calm voice rang out. The flash ray hit. The shadow cockroach construct disintegrated. F***CK. How the F***ck did you do that? Xian Zhu's Tianyuan style of foul language spread wantonly in the channel. Luonan really wanted to learn from him, who could explain why the terrifying fantasy breed, which could easily tear apart the void, was reduced to ashes after a wave of powerful light passed through. This shock even gave him a new stimulation. It made his mind forcefully pull itself together. He glanced at the virtual interface of his left eye and saw the timely short information explanation. Shadow cockroach, an outer realm species. When entering other planes of space and time, there is a high probability that it will tear apart the structure of space and time. It will react with the invaded environment to form a construct. Shadow cockroach is relatively weak and fears strong light. Luonan's head grew dizzy. Looking at this explanation, it seemed well done. Shang Min turned her head in the midst of pressing matters and spoke to Luonan. Xian Zhu's emotional reaction just now wasn't directed at Shang Min, who was executing according to the drill manual. It was because of Luonan's forceful closing of the space-time rift. Unfortunately, Luonan was destined to be unable to answer him. It could be said that Luonan didn't think at all in that instant. It was completely out of instinct. He used the syncopator to mobilize all the configuration modules in the surroundings that could be used. He probably made a small-scale space-time barrier? He really didn't have any recollection of it. In that state of his, the structure of time and space that he depended on was torn apart, and his entire body was about to collapse. How could he have the time to think calmly? Luonan's train of thought became more and more erratic. Otherwise, he wouldn't have wasted precious time on Xian Zhu's rather untimely reaction. Of course, the current stage of Luonan's focus was far too demanding. Luonan was able to control his upper and lower eyelids from fighting. It could already be said that his willpower was firm. The changes in the situation did not change according to his state and will. Instead, they happened one after another, axle 2, speed limit to 4. Shang Min's concise instructions were transmitted into Luonan's mind, which completely conformed to the norms of the drill manual. Luonan shuddered once more, and his muddled consciousness found a direction for the time being. At this moment, he couldn't even move a hair from head to toe. If he really tried to do it, he would probably fall back to Earth. It was only through thinking that he could roughly grasp the corresponding configuration structure and attempt to adjust the relevant equipment. However, Luonan was absent-minded for a moment. It seemed like he was missing something? Yes, there weren't enough syncopators. He had brought a base number of 132 syncopators, and right now, most of them had become scapegoat. They had turned into slag and scattered on the ground. Oh, if it wasn't enough, then it wasn't enough. In any case, he could do it. The corresponding thought only lasted for an instant. He didn't think too deeply before he put it into action. The frame of Luonan's body and soul interacted with the external vertical collar dynamo core. He transformed his own strength into electromagnetic waves and other material wavelengths. He controlled the remaining 40 or so syncopators and adjusted their positions within the cabin. They formed a relatively sealed force field structure, allowing his soul's strength to shuttle within. This was the basic train of thought and requirements of the Heavenly Yuan Empire's military drill. Luonan still followed the basic train of thought, but the lack of material conditions made it impossible for him to completely conform to the standards of the drill. His operation was already pressing down on the safety line, but under these circumstances, he directly broke through the safety line. Unsurprisingly, the vertical collar dynamo core sounded an alarm and attempted to correct it. The problem was, even though Luonan was extremely weak and had reached the limits of his physiology and mind at the same time, how could a mere external dynamo core be able to restrain him with his extraordinary attainments in soul strength? After entering the game scene, Luonan abided by the rules and obeyed the constraints. This was only out of respect for the Heavenly Yuan system, and he also hoped to obtain a more complete experience. But right now, he was exhausted and his mind was absent-minded. How could he care so much? He naturally operated and crossed the limits of the vertical collar dynamo core. It was only equivalent to crossing a small threshold. And then he lost control. In his half-conscious state, all of Luo Nan's execution logic was subservient to his personal instincts. He did what was familiar and comfortable. His soul strength spread out in the void. Luo Nan didn't even pay attention to the specific operation of his soul strength. After limiting the speed of the number 2 axis, he completely bid farewell to the word control and this concept. He just let himself be, fusing his biological instincts into his soul strength. There was no difference. His eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and intent all spread out along with the expansion of his soul strength. This naturally increased the range and level of Luo Nan's clairvoyance. In a certain sense, Luo Nan grew weaker and weaker, but he also grew clearer and clearer. Under the pure sensing of the psychic eye, the inside and outside of the relay station, the surrounding battlefield, the 3 tangled and conflicted sides, and even the laws and sources of their respective mobilizations of power all appeared in an unprecedented panoramic view. What should be blurry remained blurry, but Luo Nan had never experienced the great outline and layout of the collusion ever since he entered the game scene. The expansion of his soul strength was extremely fast. The complex battle situation surrounding the relay station was imprinted in Luo Nan's mind in the time it took to flash a thought. His mind had a range of cognition, so it naturally needed to increase its level. The sea of consciousness, the abyss region, the polar domain, so it turned out that the level division of the mental domain was the same here? Perhaps this was the universal truth of the universe? Luo Nan was unable to look too carefully. He just had a general understanding that the sea of consciousness and the abyss region here were much more orderly than those on Earth. There were similarities and differences in the 3 levels. It was like the scenery of a foreign country. It was quite interesting, but Luo Nan couldn't remember too much for a time. He didn't have the energy to distinguish them. It was more and more like a dream, drifting leisurely all the way to the polar domain. At the very least, Luo Nan felt that this was more or less the level. But in his days, the so-called polar domain was poles apart from Luo Nan's impression. The difference was so great that he was unable to ignore it in his current state. He was unable to bypass it. It seemed that the other side wouldn't let him go either. That was chaos. Inexplicable chaos. Fundamental disorder. Indescribable distortions. They were like casual graffiti, splashed paint, and randomly cut curtains. They spread out wantonly and boundless, filling one's field of vision. Accurately speaking, it was the entirety of all sensing dimensions. It didn't leave even the tiniest bit of space. And the other side was still closing in endlessly. It seemed to want to completely stuff this extreme chaos into Luo Nan's eyes and all of his cognition. Luo Nan was startled to the point of sobering up a bit. The polar domain? This sort of thing that was like a rag? Luo Nan found it hard to accept this sort of filthy and absurd thing. It was related to the deep and empty polar domain that he had always known. But the reality was that this chaotic and filthy element occupied the highest point of the mental plane. It was located above the abyss region and the sea of consciousness, and it was still endlessly seeping down, affecting the abyss region, affecting the sea of consciousness, affecting every region and every individual, including Luo Nan. Luo Nan's body seemed to be covered in filth in just the limited amount of time that had passed with clairvoyance. It was as if his soul strength had been soaked in filthy, stinky water. It had lost its clarity and spirituality. A feeling of vexation and nausea exploded in the depths of his heart. Luo Nan wanted to close his eyes and not look, but in the instant he avoided, countless eyes filled with indescribable emotions focused on him. It seemed that he was also one of them. It was as if he was looking at a mirror that had been severely graffitied. Or perhaps this mirror itself was pieced together from countless eyes. Luonan still had to strive to find a reason for this encounter in his current state. This chaos really broke through the limits of what he could endure. The problem was that his efforts were quickly drowned out. The chaotic logic continued to expand endlessly. Luonan was nearly convinced that he was already splitting apart. Observation and feeling had been severed. Thinking and imagination ran in opposite directions. Even his instincts were at a loss within this chaos. A sharp alarm rang out at this time. Luonan groaned miserably, but his consciousness extracted a bit from the chaos. He made a vague judgment. It wasn't from the relay station. It came from the simulator of the innerverse. Then, before Luonan could hear the specifics of the information, everything before his eyes suddenly went black. It was as if the system had crashed on a black screen. It didn't reboot. It was good that it didn't reboot. Luonan let out a breath of relief. Cold sweat had already drenched the hair on the back of his head. His heart was beating at a rate that was about to ignite a fire within his internal organs. This was vile poison. Vile poison pollution. Luonan locked onto this answer almost immediately. But just as this concept became clear in his mind, the chaotic mess and filth that could drive a person insane appeared once more on the black screen that erased all information. It was deeply engraved in his eyes and in his heart. Just its existence alone was enough to cause one's heart to palpitate with fear. F***ck me. Luonan's body bounced up and he waved his hand with force. He wanted to wave away these things that were even more vexing than flies in the darkness. Luonan waved his arm twice and suddenly woke up. He was truly awake this time. A thin quilt slid down from his body. The quiet and spacious room carried the soft sound of water. He was wearing an exoskeleton armor, withstanding the rain of fire from the sky, and the battlefield environment where many channels of information interweave. Chapter 937. Luonan had already exited the game. However, he didn't even have the time to sigh about anything. The sin poison, that chaotic and dirty elemental energy, wantonly revealed its presence and continued to permeate him. Actually, Luonan knew very well in his heart that this was just a fragment of an impression that existed in his memories. There was no real impact to speak of. But it was precisely because there was no substance to it that it lingered and did not disperse. This was what made Luonan even more irritated. He forcefully flung the thin blanket on his body to one side, as if he could use this method to completely separate himself from the mess and filth. Of course, it was useless. My lord? Luonan was in the master bedroom. Snake Tongue's figure was reflected outside the bamboo lattice door. Her tone was a bit hesitant. She seemed uncertain. Luonan didn't feel like replying to her. He continued to fight against the corrosion of the chaotic and disorderly impressions. His breathing grew heavier and heavier. 2 seconds passed before the door was pushed open to the side. The sound of wood rubbing against each other was extremely soft and slow. But in Luonan's ears right now, it was clearly the most torturous noise. He immediately glared at him angrily. Snake Tongue, who was walking in on her knees, suddenly raised her head and met Luonan's gaze head-on. Snake Tongue was startled, and then her body tensed up. She sucked in a short breath, and her mouth emitted a loud and clear sound of air. For someone with her temperament, this was already an extreme loss of self-control. The more she acted like this, the more she attracted Luonan's attention. Luonan stared at Snake Tongue with a fiery rage. Snake Tongue subconsciously wanted to bend her head to avoid his stare, but it seemed that her movements were too large. She stretched her neck, causing her body to go stiff. She couldn't move sideways. It was also as if invisible fingers were pinching her cheek. She couldn't move freely. "What's your name?" Luonan's voice was dull and hoarse. His voice sounded like dry wood scraping against each other. Snake Tongue couldn't answer. In fact, she couldn't even control her eyelids right now. She wanted to close her eyes, but she could only shake her eyelashes. Soon, the veins on her fair neck and forehead began to bulge and throb slightly. In the end, his entire body was trembling, as if he had seen something extremely terrifying, or perhaps he had been forcefully injected with a fatal poison. "You've seen something incredible from me. You can even infect me like this?" Luonan muttered. Even he himself couldn't hear his muffled voice too clearly. This wasn't a good thing. This was because he could feel that as Snake Tongue was struck, the chaotic and dirty elements suddenly expanded their territory. Many more irregular transformations occurred, making the chaos even more chaotic and harder to control. What the hell? Luonan's heart grew more and more restless, to the point where he vented his anger on someone else. It was undoubtedly Snake Tongue's fault. If she hadn't come over to disturb him, things wouldn't have reached this stage. This was what Luonan thought in his heart, but the gaze Luonan shot over became all the more unkind. The blood drained from Snake Tongue's face. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, but it was as if an invisible noose had gripped her neck. All her words were stuck in her throat. Luonan, on the other hand, had a gloomy expression. He slowly got up and walked over to Snake Tongue. He sat across from her, sticking extremely close to her. In this way, he could indeed see more clearly. In particular, he could sense that Snake Tongue had suddenly lost control of her aura. There was a rather typical quality amidst the chaos. The so-called model was learned from the military drill of the Heavenly Yuan Empire. While Luonan was observing Snake Tongue, he subconsciously wanted to cut her open to make a diagnosis. Only then did he realize that there wasn't a syncopator beside him. This was even more vexing. He didn't even bring a tiny syncopator with him when he came out of the game setting. In the end, with just a glance, he had provoked the most dangerous thing on the other side. Should he find someone to reason with? The Innerverse simulator? The corner of Luonan's lips twitched. He didn't make a sound. He just extended his hand and touched Snake Tongue's pale cheek. He didn't have a syncopator, but he understood basic calculation principles. He was barely able to extrapolate. Snake Tongue was trembling. Luonan could clearly feel this. Of course, she was afraid as well. She was more afraid than she had been in the past. The source of her fear undoubtedly came from Luonan. Her gaze was still firmly glued to Luonan's face. It was hard for her to move an inch. What in the world did she see? Luonan couldn't be too certain. But after performing calculations and comparing the parameters provided by the drill manual, he quickly came to a basic conclusion. It was evil poison without a doubt. Moreover, the process of the evil poison's environmental pollution had begun. Luonan laughed. This was a laugh triggered by the absurdity. On Earth? Did he become a carrier of the virus? And the most ludicrous and laughable thing was that he had carried it out from the virtual game setting? What a joke! Snake Tongue let out a cry of pain. Luonan subconsciously used his fingers to clasp her cheek. He exerted some force. She had probably injured some facial muscle or a bone seam or joint somewhere. "So, what stupid thing did you do?" Luonan pressed forward a bit more. The tip of his nose was practically touching the tip of his nose. His forehead was touching her forehead. His voice was hoarse as he spoke to Snake Tongue. The distance was too close. Snake Tongue's gaze was unable to focus. It was already lax. Perhaps this was a good thing for her. She was finally able to break free from some visible terror from Luonan's body. Even though her pretty face was a bit deformed from Luonan's pinching, the expression on her face was much richer. She even opened and closed her lips to emit a silent word. "What?" Of course, Luonan didn't hear her clearly. His hand unconsciously loosened a bit. Then he heard Snake Tongue's intermittent voice. "Your Excellency. You also have fear?" Was this awareness? Luonan was a bit startled. His absurd emotions immediately magnified, and he laughed involuntarily once more. This pushed his emotions to take a large turn. The flames of irritation and anger suddenly transformed into an absurd and nonsensical casually leaping excitement. He didn't respond to Snake Tongue's question. His hand decreased a bit more force, caressing her smooth skin. He experienced the sensation of the shallowest layer. He wanted to continue watching. He wanted to see the result. He wanted to see how this beautiful skin would mutate and even be destroyed under the terrifying laws of poison. If he continued, this would most likely be realized. As for the reason, curiosity was the reason. Therefore, he supported Snake Tongue's face. He looked at the vile environment he had brought back and built with his own hand. He looked at how the chaotic and destructive negative elements seeped into this beautiful body and into her tenacious soul. This was the vile poison of the past. It was currently corroding the framework of her body and soul, the foundation of her cultivation. Perhaps it could be a bit faster? This was insanity. Reason finally shrieked in the corner, heavily pounding on his nerves. You're in an abnormal state. There's a problem with your emotions. You've clearly been infected, but you're excited because of the accelerated destruction of the person you've infected. This is the path to death. Luonan should understand, but he was like a hopeless degenerate. He was immersed in the breeding and spreading tendencies of destruction, vainly hoping to obtain feedback from within. The current Luonan lacked the patience to deal with complex problems. It didn't matter if he cut through the Gordian knot or if he abandoned himself to despair. He wanted to see the results as soon as possible, regardless of whether it was good or bad. People always had similar mental and emotional ups and downs. But Luonan's body was like pressing the fast-forward button. His weak state facilitated this process. Before he could react, he had already collapsed to the point of no return. Reason was like the sound of a mosquito when the heavens fell and the earth split. It clearly existed, but it was powerless. It was just like what he felt when he glimpsed the curtains of the so-called polar domain in the game setting. His perception and thoughts were split and misplaced. From his body to his mind, he was out of balance everywhere. Luonan was watching Snake Tongue's destruction. Wasn't he the same? In a certain sense, Snake Tongue was a reflection of his own state. The two of them were grasshoppers tied to the same rope. Both of them were falling apart at a speed visible to the naked eye. Then, they completely merged into the extreme chaos and disorder. It was like Luonan was sitting in reverse for a certain instant. Everything he experienced, everything he remembered, everything he learned, and everything he cultivated. This included the learning and harvests he gained from the game setting, the growth and advancement he gained from fighting against the Amaterasu Order, the large profits he earned from killing Gong Chi, the explosive increase in his soul strength after erecting the spiderweb of the altar, and even the primordial foundation bestowed upon him by the formatting theory system. The strict assembly of order collapsed one after another, returning to meaningless chaos. It no longer mattered whether this was an illusion or reality. If Luonan truly believed it, then the barrier between reality and illusion would be as fragile as a bubble. Of course Luonan didn't want to believe it. He only had a bit of reason left, and he was still struggling. He tried to return to his rightful position and let order dominate everything once more. But his attempts were drowned in the chaotic and misplaced thoughts and emotions. He failed time and time again. Every time he failed, he would cut off a large chunk of the structure of order, throwing it into the abyss of chaos. It wasn't just Luonan himself who was affected in the span of a few breaths. The living starry sky, the large production line, the spiderweb of the altar, and other mental world structures he had built upon the foundation of formatting theory were shaking as well. The destructive power of sin poison was attempting to pollute and destroy everything in one fell swoop. If Luonan's soul strength hadn't been exhausted and completely shrunk, then the entire earth would have fallen in the blink of an eye with the range his soul strength could cover. The sin poison was temporarily unable to spread, but Luonan's foundation had collapsed. What would happen to the other people attached to his system? Luonan was already unable to consider such a complicated problem. He was lucky enough to be able to analyze the situation before his eyes. But at this moment something unexpected popped up. The Wraith sign. This projection incarnation of the demon watched as the altar spiderweb that it was clinging to moved toward decay. Instead, it screamed noiselessly amidst the collapsing chaos. It was particularly excited, but it was unknown whether it was fear or joy. Or perhaps it was praise for the nature of chaos. This fellow, Luonan didn't understand. How did he suddenly notice the Wraith sign? How did he have the leisure to pay attention to such details? But it was precisely this leisure that drew out a bit of his extremely chaotic state of mind. It was like a sewer pipe that was stuffed full of filth. A gap suddenly burst open, but it didn't immediately clear up. Instead, Luonan heard a muffled echo. It was a faintly discernible rumble that soon became clear and distinct. Walala, walala. Chapter 938. The Heavily Chained Crow. The materialization of the rules of formatting theory, my heart's a prison, was the embodiment of control and coercive power. It was also Luonan's original foundation. When Luonan's extraordinary power sprouted, it became the most special symbol. It was preserved at the very bottom. As Luonan's power level continued to rise, his accumulated techniques grew richer and richer. He rarely used the power of the heavily chained crow. At most, he used it to control the Wraith sign. And now, when everything was withering, decaying, and collapsing, the heavily chained crow appeared once more. It still maintained its fixed form. It still continued to maintain its rhythm and meaning. It still firmly locked the Wraith sign. No matter how deranged it was, it wouldn't cause a backlash. Luonan took in a long breath. His wildly beating heart seemed to be tied up by chains. From his perspective, it was better than nothing. The unchanging nature of the heavily chained crow was the most obvious lighthouse amidst the avalanche of chaos. It allowed him to have a bit of a sense of direction amidst the vast expanse of chaos. He wouldn't be completely lost. Such an effect was absolutely not an exaggeration to say that it was a cornerstone, a stabilizing needle. Why did it have this kind of effect? This scene felt a bit familiar. Luonan's consciousness drifted once more, but it was no longer a depraved loss of control. Instead, he used the manic Wraith sign and the stable heavily chained crow as primers. He made a reasonable association and completed a jump with a clear direction. Suddenly, a grand image appeared out of nowhere. No, this wasn't just an image. It was a complex movement that pierced through the barrier of space and time. It cut into the tree-hole space within the misty labyrinth. It connected with the lens and cast into the depths of the boundless sandstorm. It had a clear direction, and because its goal was clear, it quickly received a response. Luonan's consciousness broke free from the chaos. In the blink of an eye, it fell into an incomparably deep and grand world. Once again, he saw the abyss sun wheel and the absolute chained prison clashing against each other. They kept each other in check and balance. The dazzling abyss sun wheel expanded and shrunk at times. Flames gushed out, transforming into tens of thousands of demons. The heavily chained crow crisscrossed layer upon layer, resonating with a howl. The humming sound was no different from last time. This included the flood of information hidden beneath this magnificent scene. Observation meant contact, connection, and conduction. In an instant, the grand image that was merely a silhouette of the vast space-time was shattered. The violent and warped dynamic changes and the flood of information hidden deep within the changes burst forth once more. The flood of information surged toward Luonan. In the blink of an eye, the flood of information from the solar wheel extreme prison drowned his consciousness. Right now, Luonan's soul cloak had withered, and the altar's spiderweb had decayed. The buffer medium was no longer present. He was practically facing the onslaught of the flood head-on. However, he wasn't smashed to death in the water, because at that very moment, the chaotic, disorderly, and dirty elements of the sin poison almost filled up his consciousness. The waterway was already half filled up. If another wave of water rushed over, not only would it burst the dam, the front and back would also have to be stirred up. With this stir, a new change was stirred up. Both sides were in chaos, but chaos was different. A comparative thought popped up in Luo Nan's mind at this time. They were both warped and chaotic. The flood of information from the solar wheel extreme prison was just a large number of fragments of order and rules gathered together. There was something real inside. In comparison, the sin poison seemed more like a deliberate and malicious distortion. Luo Nan didn't know if his judgment was correct or not. However, the mixing of the two types of chaos was far more complex and intense than what he felt or imagined. The chaos still existed, but a powerful chemical reaction was clearly formed between them. It was so powerful that Luo Nan's consciousness turned into a mass of chaotic mist in the blink of an eye. It was impossible for Luo Nan to pry into the explosive details within unless he was truly tired of living. The only thing he could confirm was that there should be a relatively large-scale erosion or transformation between the two. This was because Luo Nan's current pitiful capacity of bearing or depth did not cause his head to explode in an instant. Instead, it was as if he was being brushed by water vapor within the pervasive chaotic mist. It was warm, it was cool, of course, he would still swell and he would still get hurt. Luo Nan felt that he had grown a size fatter. He seemed to have become cumbersome. This was the reaction of the substantial pressure on the mental plane sinking down to his bones. However, the boundary between pain and comfort was blurred under this bizarre situation. It was hard for him to assess the severity of his injuries. Actually, it was meaningless. If he couldn't get through this, the Heavenly Yuan Empire's military drill manual would clearly state what would happen to him under the heavy contamination of the sin poison. Should I just wait foolishly in the primal chaos? Luo Nan just had this thought when he discovered the extremely excited wraith sign within the primal chaos. There was also the image of the heavily chained crow that connected him to the wraith sign. In a certain sense, the two could be considered as Luo Nan's perceptual tentacles. He could use them to sense the inside and outside. Their existences gave Luo Nan an additional sense of existence within the primal chaos. Existence itself was order. Moreover, it was order that Luo Nan could sense, control, and extend. Luo Nan was dazed for a moment. He looked at the two existences that maintained an extremely strong sense of existence within the primal chaos. The associative route that he had projected earlier was reversed. From the majestic solar wheel extreme prison to the wraith sign and the heavily chained crow. The wraith sign was the projection of the abyssal sun wheel. The heavily chained crow was the reflection of the extreme prison. Since this was the case, why didn't the relationship and structure of the two be projected from the solar wheel extreme prison? No, they were originally like this. I just didn't understand it. As soon as this thought was born, the wraith sign suddenly let out a soundless hiss. Its ugly form collapsed into a shadow of nothingness. Soon, a demonic red light seeped out from within. The color of the light vaguely resembled the flames of the abyss sun wheel. The heavily chained crow also changed. It began to divide. 1 became 2, 2 became 4, 4 became 8. It wrapped around the glowing wraith sign. Relatively speaking, the chain after division was a bit more nothingness. But in Luo Nan's eyes, the interweaving and disorderly structure possessed a more substantial configuration meaning than when it was a single chain. In the blink of an eye, a miniature solar wheel extreme prison appeared on the plane of Luo Nan's consciousness. In terms of vastness and boundlessness, it was like heaven and earth when compared to the main body. In terms of subtlety and profoundness, it was unattainable when compared to the main body. But it was similar. It wasn't similar in a simple sense. Instead, it was a projection and mapping in terms of structural rules and functional relationship. Especially when Luo Nan's consciousness was cast over, some minor discordant details began to rapidly adjust and mend. There was Luo Nan's aesthetic perception within, and there was also a kind of attractive force, from Luo Nan's submerged memories, and from the currently pervading primal chaos mist. The Wraith sign gathered relevant rules and information, continuously perfecting them. A red glow gradually seeped out from the primal chaos. Chapter 939. The red light illuminated a portion of the area, helping Luo Nan see order within the chaos. At the very least, he could try to understand what the internal conflict was like within the chaotic mist that pervaded the entire plane of consciousness. The heavily chained crow and the wraith sign were, of course, Luo Nan himself. They were located at the center of the chaotic mist. They made an elementary imitation of the imagery and laws of Sunwheel Extreme Prison. Actually, they actively guided the power of Sunwheel Extreme Prison to cross space and resist the corruption of sinful poison. Regardless of whether Luo Nan did it intentionally or not, this was an established fact. It was impossible for Luo Nan to utilize the power of Sunwheel Extreme Prison, especially the roaring torrent of information, to cleanse the universe in one fell swoop with Luo Nan's control and analytical abilities. But when the primal chaos fog collided, a strange feeling gradually appeared. The filthy curtain that seemed to be rooted in Luo Nan's memories was washed back and forth by the torrent of information from Sunwheel Extreme Prison. It was warped by an even more powerful power of distortion, to the point of being washed away. Though it still looked the same, Luo Nan became more and more familiar with it the more he looked at it. Luo Nan repeated the familiarity over and over again. It was like staring at a character and looking at it hundreds of times. Suddenly, it became unfamiliar. In reality, this was a kind of semantic saturation phenomenon. After the brain received the same stimulation over and over again, it produced a nervous fatigue that caused it to enter a state of inhibition. Luo Nan's current situation was pretty much the same. His brain nerves were far more than tired under the violent flood of information. They were simply overworked. With sinful poison as the central axis of stimulation, it gave him continuous attacks. If it were anyone else, they would have long since gone insane, gone mad, and their body and soul would have collapsed. However, Luo Nan had a layer of chaotic mist as a buffer. He forcefully withstood over 100 waves of attacks, holding on to the point of nervous suppression. His ability to distinguish and associate dropped substantially. He was unable to absorb the destructive power of sinful poison's law distortion. He could only pay attention to a portion of its structure. The problem was, when he looked at it this way, why did he feel that the other side was more handsome? Suddenly, Luo Nan discovered a new world. The environment of laws created by sinful poison was admittedly chaotic to the extreme, but it seemed that it could be disassembled? His analytical ability hadn't reached the level where he could immediately see through the mysteries. However, there was a trend that the heavily chained crow and the wraith sign, which already possessed some kind of highly integrated ability, especially the structure of the Sunwheel Extreme Hell, that they imitated, only needed an inducement to be effective. When Luo Nan muddle-headedly swept his eyes over the specious fragments contained within the sin poison, the Sunwheel Extreme Prison had already taken the first step. Part of the evil poison had been broken down. At least that was what Luo Nan saw. Luo Nan was still not too clear on the fundamental framework for the birth and existence of sin poison. However, he was still able to understand the parts of sin poison that had been stripped away by the scouring and collision. Luo Nan saw that the fragments that had been torn apart originally had their own source and flow of laws. It was just that the portions that had suffered deliberate distortions were stripped off one after another and precipitated. Some of them even realized a return to normal, turning into law fragments. They attached themselves to the heavily chained crow and gradually fused with it. As for the inexplicable and pure chaotic parts, after they were extracted, They were swallowed up by the miniature sun wheel formed by the wraith sign and burned fiercely as fuel. Of course, the sin poison that filled one's vision and filled one's soul wasn't something that could be easily digested. The conflict between the Sunwheel Extreme Prison and the evil poison continued. It was very likely that this conflict would continue for a long time. The mist of primal chaos was still growing endlessly, continuing to give Luo Nan immense pressure. However, things always developed in a good direction, right? Luo Nan watched for a long time, but the phenomenon of semantic saturation did not occur again. Instead, he gained more insight into the combined architectural pattern manifested by the continued decomposition of the evil poison. It didn't seem like a misconception. Luo Nan's finger subconsciously twitched twice. It was with great difficulty that he was able to restrain the impulse to draw a diagram out of thin air. As expected, I'm still a person on the side of order. Luo Nan knew that he had retreated from the edge of the cliff once more to be able to have this leisure. And because of this, true pleasure, the kind that could be controlled, was like a sweet spring that overflowed from the cracks in his heart. It rapidly healed the wounds that were on the verge of collapse. Only now did Luo Nan discover that his entire body was drenched in cold sweat. His mental state was quite good. Perhaps the saying, when things reach an extreme, they will move in the opposite direction, really made a bit of sense. After a round of conflict, he had actually recovered a bit from his extreme weakness. He looked at Snake Tongue. The evil poison could be contagious, and it could be contagious in her current state. Snake Tongue's complexion wasn't as pale as before. However, she had been acting as Luo Nan's test subject for the past few days. Her energy was lacking, and now she encountered this matter. She was caught in the crossfire, and she was in a worse state than Luo Nan. Her back could no longer support itself. She couldn't straighten her body. She was half lying on the ground, on the verge of collapse. Luo Nan couldn't help but feel a bit guilty when he saw her appearance. He got up and walked over. He asked warmly, "Are you feeling a bit better?" Snake Tongue heard this and forcefully propped her body up. Luo Nan was both admiring and a bit amused when he saw her appearance. "I'm afraid your luck has been exhausted up in the clouds. These days really haven't been easy." People always lacked self-awareness in times like this. Snake Tongue's eyes were half closed, and her pupils tilted to the side. She did her best to keep her voice steady and not trembling. "I've disturbed my lord's ocular technique cultivation. It's my fault." "What cultivation? Ocular technique?" Luo Nan was startled with a laugh. He suddenly had some thoughts. He pointed at his eyes. "Here?" Fortunately, Snake Tongue was able to understand his meaning. Her eyelids drooped, and she spoke in a soft voice, "My lord's divine ability." Luo Nan only knew that Snake Tongue had been infected by him, but he didn't have the time to review the channel of infection. If it was really as Snake Tongue said, then he could transmit the evil poison with just his eyes, causing the target to be contaminated. This really could be considered a type of ocular technique. Was his brain still sluggish? It wasn't easy for him to calm down, and now he had the guts to use the evil poison? The heavily chained crow and the new version of the wraith sign structure must have made him arrogant. Luo Nan really wanted to knock himself on the head, and let his reason occupy a high position once more. But this thought was born, and his mind was like a cat scratching at it. He had glimpsed some of the outline of the structure during the partial decomposition of the evil poison. The outline transformed into abstract lines that danced in his mind. His fingers twitched more and more fiercely. Luckily, Luo Nan didn't have the time to ponder this deeply. The distant signal was transferred and received by the external neuron. Zhang Yingying's voice came roaring over, "What the hell is going on?" There was a bang and the signal disappeared. The ground was covered in mercury. "I nearly called the police, you scum." Hearing this, Luo Nan's smile, which had just calmed down, surged up once more. It carried a few absurd emotions of déjà vu, but these emotions were already real and controllable. Only now did Luo Nan truly feel the force field of the real world gently covering his body. He really had come out from the game setting. Even though he had been smuggled in by the evil poison, he could still see it. He was still alive, right? Luo Nan really wanted to say thank you to his grandfather. Thank you to his grandfather. It was his notebook that had laid down such an indestructible foundation for him. Of course, he also needed to thank the sunwheel hell in the distant deep space. Luo Nan was becoming more and more convinced that it was very likely that it was the true source of formatting theory's power. Are you going crazy again? Speaking of which, we're going to land in 2 hours. Are you coming or not? I'm coming. Of course I'm coming. Luo Nan blurted out. He looked through the cabin's porthole to look at the color of the sky outside. He saw the sunset filling the sky. He looked at his watch again. It was already 6 o'clock in the evening in Ban City. Before he went to sleep, Zhang Yingying had told him the time. It was approximately 10:30 in the morning in Xia City. Ban City was an hour ahead of Xia City. This meant that he had slept for approximately 7 hours. And in the game setting, a total of at least 70 hours had passed. In other words, the difference in the flow of time had reached 10 times. It looked like he had profited, and it was a huge profit. The amount of time he could control, or even his lifespan, had been extended by 10 times in an instant. But Luo Nan pondered it carefully, especially when he looked at his own state, and he had some doubts. His soul strength was empty. His soul cloak had collapsed. The altar's spiderweb had decayed. Admittedly, these things could be regenerated, but for them to grow to such a scale was the result of Luo Nan's accumulation over the past few months. He had squeezed them dry in a short 7 hours. This sort of consumption made Luo Nan feel rather uneasy. There was also the uninvited evil poison. Even though it had been suppressed and a portion of it had been dealt with, could there really be no repercussions for existences on the plane of laws? Let's not talk about the excessively fictitious ones. There was the most realistic one. Luo Nan had just promised Zhang Yingying that he would go meet up with them. Let's not talk about the real person. Even if it was his water vapor avatar, his soul cloak had collapsed. It was hard to avoid having to rack his brain again. Another period of awkward blankness passed. Zhang Yingying was convinced. Hello? You went on a mental journey again. Did you save the world in your dream? Did you win or lose? Say something. I nearly destroyed the world, it's true. Luo Nan responded with sincerity. He ignored Zhang Yingying's laughter and curses for the time being. He looked into the mental plane and grasped his own state. He began to seriously consider a plan to remedy the situation. It was strange. According to Luo Nan's usual way of thinking, he should be thinking in the direction of the mental plane, the soul cloak, the polar region of the abyss, and so on. He had done this before, and he had long since become familiar with it. But right now, the above directions and plans only ran through his mind, and he was unable to raise any interest. Admittedly, part of this was due to Luo Nan's large amount of soul strength and the accumulation of his framework being annihilated in a puff of smoke. But there was an even greater factor. Luo Nan felt that there wasn't much technical content. Speaking of which, Luo Nan had spent 70 hours in the game setting. He had already fiercely raised the aesthetic level of the configuration design and application. Yes, the Heavenly Yuan Empire didn't have a purely mental configuration application, but the strict, systematic, and highly efficient configuration model was deep and enchanting. Once one touched upon the basics and experienced the richness of its contents, one would be unable to stop. Hello? Hello? Luo Yuanwei, this attitude of yours won't do. Luo Nan's soul was called back by Zhang Yingying, but this allowed his pure aesthetic impulse to take the upper hand. He responded with a sound and then smeared honey on his mouth. Sister Yingying, I want to ask you something. Do you have any processing tools over at the airship? Do you have a fever? Chapter 940. This request isn't excessive, right? I just need to process a very small item. The precision requirement is just SOSO. Luonan's tone weakened as he spoke. He thought about it from another perspective. It really was excessive. Her Majesty Empress Wu's private airship wasn't an Earth patroller. All sorts of equipment and accessories were readily available. They could be processed and repaired at any time and any place. Luonan's way of thinking was still stuck in the game setting. Cough. The previous plan didn't work. Then, what do you want to process? Zhang Yingying suddenly asked him. There was a subtle change in her voice. It became much more reserved and proper. Though Luonan couldn't see the situation on the other side, he naturally followed the attitude of the other side and gave a more detailed introduction. This is a small tool called the syncopator. Its main purpose is to act as a medium for soul strength, to establish a relatively sealed interference environment. It has a prescribed shape. It isn't complicated. With a mold, it can be mass-produced. Are there any requirements for the materials? Well, it would be best if there were shape memory alloys with high fatigue resistance. There are similar products on the market. I've seen them here in Ban City. It's fine if there aren't any. I've also considered ordinary magnesium-aluminum-carbon alloys, mutant skeletons. Will water crystals work? Boss said that she can help, but the materials are certainly not enough. Mechanical creations can't do it, but we can use the condensation ring to create high-strength water crystals. Oh, Her Majesty Empress Wu? Luonan was shocked, but he quickly reacted. He slapped his thigh and said, yes. Of course it's possible. This is a consumable item. In terms of plasticity, the chemical bonds. It needs a few more forms. I'll take care of this on the blueprint. In the end, Luonan remembered Her Majesty Empress Wu's identity. It wasn't good for her to waste time looking for a solution. He decided to do his own homework. Speaking of which, Luonan really did diligently research in the game setting. He studied how to use Earth's current technological conditions to reproduce the problem of the syncopator after returning to reality. He took some time out of his busy schedule to look up and download quite a bit of information. He even made a plan. The syncopator was famous for being easy to learn, easy to use, and low in cost. It had a wide range of applications, and the information was extremely large. Among them, many of them were based on the experiences of surviving in the wilderness or fleeing for their lives, using materials from the ground and improvising on the spot. But the specific details. Hiss! Suddenly, electricity passed through Luonan's brain. There really was electricity. The external neuron coiled in the depths of Luonan's brain was radiating electricity at this moment, manifesting its existence. The sizable flow of information poured into Luonan's perceptual plane in this form. It formed images, scenes, blueprints, and words that quickly flipped through. The vast majority of them were extremely familiar, and they were highly related to the problem of the scintometer that Luonan was currently pondering over. Luonan even saw the contents of the fantasy mimicry skill chip given to him by Lieutenant Go Yi. Luonan's mind was in a trance. He heard Zhang Yingying urging him on the blueprint. Luonan responded as he used the external neuron's search and organize function to comb through the flow of information. There were keywords such as syncopator, ice, structure, and other keywords in his mind. The corresponding solutions were simply queuing up to jump out of his mind. It was so comfortable. Luonan studied and worked within the game scene. This was the state he was in. It wasn't some great invention that would shock the heavens and make the gods weep. The predecessors had researched it and formed a system. How delightful it was to use it on the spot. This was much better than tormenting and fumbling in the mental domain by himself. He had many mature solutions as a reference. He made fine adjustments to the design on this basis. His train of thought flowed smoothly, and he finished the draft after chatting with Zhang Yingying for a bit. I just sent it over. Zhang Yingying laughed. Don't be a scribble. The boss doesn't have the leisure to read your psychic drawing. Zhang Yingying didn't say anything after that. 7 or 8 seconds passed before Luonan couldn't help but ask her, "Is there a problem?" Zhang Yingying went, "Yeah." Then she corrected him, "No. I mean, what's this called again?" "It's the scintometer, big sis." Zhang Yingying wasn't annoyed. She simply evaluated. "It seems quite interesting." She paused for a moment before letting out an emotional sigh. "Speaking of which, this is the first time I've been able to understand a drawing you've drawn. It's not that I understand it. I just have a general understanding of the flow. The portrait doesn't count." "Is that a compliment?" "Of course. It's not just me. You can go ask Bamboo Pole and the others. In the past, you were like a heavenly steed soaring into the sky. In times like this, either we're idiots or you're mentally ill. Choose one of the two. Which one do you choose?" Luonan decisively chose neither. Zhang Yingying didn't know what sort of resources Luonan had used to complete the scintometer blueprint. She didn't know how many circles Luonan had gone in. She had a misunderstanding that wasn't too big nor too small. She asked casually, "Did you rely on this to realize your water vapor clone?" There's a bit of a difference. I definitely need this right now." "I understand." The small misunderstanding didn't affect Zhang Yingying's ability to understand. "I'll give it to the boss right away. Don't worry. With my understanding of the boss, a toy of this level isn't a problem." "All right. Thank Her Majesty Empress Wu on my behalf." Luonan didn't know if Her Majesty Empress Wu was by Zhang Yingying's side right now, but he still had to say what needed to be said. He reminded her in the end, "Notify me when you're done. There's still the assembly segment. I'll need your help then." "No problem. You don't need to worry about time. At most, I'll notify the cockpit and have them circle around the Pacific Ocean a few more times." "Oh my. I owe you a favor." "It's good that you know. Go on your knees. Go." Luonan really wasn't good at being talkative. He could only retreat in defeat. But speaking a few more words always made his mood a bit better. He laughed as he hung up the call, but he soon restrained himself a bit. Her Majesty Empress Wu's face flashed before his eyes. It was uncertain. Luonan pondered for a moment and tossed these thoughts to the back of his mind for the time being. He contacted Lu again. Yes, this was done through the external neuron adapter wristband. Lu clearly wasn't used to this sort of method. She asked probingly, "Mister? Where are you?" "I'm on the front deck. I'll be right there." "Okay, no need. I'll send you a set of blueprints. Give it to the Master Guard and have them work on it as soon as possible. The materials are divided into 2 types, skeletons and metals. We need 2 of each. No, 4 base numbers. The specific number and requirements are all written on it." At this moment, Luonan thought of the external module of the Frozen Alive installation. He learned from the previous example of a shortage of syncopators, so he casually doubled the number. Lu had just responded when Luonan said, "There's also T-City. It's more convenient for you to make arrangements. Prepare some as well." "T-City? Ah yes. Is the same number okay?" "It's enough." Luonan didn't want to bother Her Majesty Empress Wu too much. Moreover, the materials for the water crystal were worrisome based on the data. Luonan could only deal with it temporarily. In the end, he needed to return to a mature material plan. After giving these instructions, Luonan casually asked, "How's the situation over at T-City?" Chapter 941. Luonan was just speaking casually, but Lu didn't dare to take it lightly. She immediately said, "I was just about to report to you. After Cadman was crippled, some changes have occurred in T-City. Currently, the Blood Flame Order that Lu was managing was in an extremely complicated situation. Cadman's fall had created a huge power vacuum in the T-City local faction of the Blood Flame Order. It was the perfect time for the Xia City headquarters faction to fill the vacuum. But at the same time, Mrs. Halder's whereabouts were unknown. Yin Lu, who held the power on behalf of the Blood Flame Order, was thousands of kilometers away. The Xia City headquarters faction was more or less slow in their response. After losing Cadman, the local tyrant, the Blood Flame Order would become an outsider in D City's territory. They would definitely have to face the retaliation of the local forces, and this local was not just the Blood Flame Order's internal structure. Luonan wasn't good at this kind of thing, but as the new boss of the Blood Flame Order, he had to show some concern. I remember that T-City has a lot of power? Yes. T-City has military, political, business, and religion. It's quite prosperous as well. It's one of the core offices of the world government, a famous paradise for sea explorers, and an important trading center for mutated goods. The power of the secular world is very strong. The number of ability users from the inner world, especially those who have registered with the society, will explode at any time. Some powerful people are willing to stay there for a long time. In terms of prosperity, it's top-notch. Luonan understood what Yin Lu was implying. The distribution is complicated and they keep each other in check. No wonder you chose T-City. They're just struggling to survive. Yin Lu gave a small compliment. It's all thanks to you being here that many people have dispelled their thoughts. Everyone is just watching from the other side of the river. It's an impromptu action. With Luonan's limited political wisdom, he could guess that the reason why the powerful local faction of T-City hadn't made a move yet was because they were afraid of Mr. Mo's powerful suppressive power. They couldn't interfere. Furthermore, the important meeting named Auction on the Sea, which was also known as New Plains Scouting Meeting, was about to begin. The real major forces were in a tacit state of silence. What's more, they didn't know that Luonan, who was playing the role of Mr. Mo, had exhausted his strength from playing games. It would be quite difficult for him to exert his strength from a distance and intimidate the entire world in a short amount of time. Needless to say, as long as he was beaten to a pulp by the true gods and Pope of the Amaterasu cult, the situation in D-City would definitely change again. It was probably because he had jumped out of the chess game for a period of time. His mind was empty, and Luonan reflected on his own actions. You guys should be having a headache over me being too high profile. It would be fine if the church was one of the big three, but it's not. In this case, it's hard to say whether it's a blessing or a curse. Yin Lu paused for a moment, but quickly said, "What's the difference between the Blood Flame Order and Mr.? Even your madam can't afford to say that." In such a situation, if Madame Halder were to step forward, given her current level of power, be it in terms of intimidation or authority, it would be the best for the Blood Flame Order. But did she stand up for him? It had been over 10 days since he killed Gong Qi, but there was still no movement from that side. His injuries were too severe, and he needed time to regenerate his flesh and blood? That's not right. The situation over there could be hidden from anyone, but it could not be hidden from Luonan. Was it a hidden pawn plotting a grand scheme? Or was it purely emptiness? It was said that many people would be dominated by a so-called feeling of emptiness for a period of time after they completed a certain long-term goal. Unfortunately, Luonan was unable to empathize with them. As he continued to advance in the process of opening up formatting theory, the resources he grasped continued to accumulate. Inexplicably, his enemies grew more and more numerous. They filled the entire world. Right now, he didn't even need to use his own motivation. There were naturally people who forced him forward. In the eyes of many people, his behavior was relatively easy to predict. Madame Halder was different. In a certain sense, Luonan could dominate Madame Halder, but he was still unable to understand her thoughts. Complicated. Truly complicated. In comparison, there were also life and death trials. Being a maintenance soldier in the game scene was far simpler. Yin Lu didn't know Luonan's current situation and mentality, but she knew what Luonan was most concerned about. She felt that the topic of the Order's governance and survival wasn't suitable to continue, so she changed the topic. According to your arrangements, Mr., the preparations for the guidance ritual have been completed. If Mr. needs it, we can begin testing at any time. Oh, you're ready. Of course, Luonan remembered that he had arranged for Lu to prepare ahead of time. He would guide the believers of the Blood Flame Order into the virtual world of the Innerverse Simulator to conduct internal testing, just like Snake Tongue. But he never expected that he would be one step ahead of her. He would experience an unimaginably deep level of depth. His thoughts naturally drifted toward the Blood Soul Temple in the Abyss District. He looked at the relevant arrangements. His soul strength had shrunk greatly. Although he could still sense the various believers, as well as the targets he controlled directly and indirectly, it was more like pulling a kite string. The precision of his senses had decreased. Let's leave it at that for now. I'll let you know if there are any areas that need to be fixed. Luonan didn't rashly spit out his approval. Putting aside his unexpected circumstances, Snake Tongue's experience showed that internal testing was not an easy matter. It involved hundreds and thousands of core believers of the Blood Flame Order. One could never be too careful. Plus, everything could only be carried out after the Innerverse Simulator was rebooted. Luonan unconsciously sighed after hanging up. Time passed by the minute and second. The virtual plane that he hoped to bring out had yet to truly begin. It would be a lie to say that he wasn't anxious. Fortunately, from the game's scene, Luonan was more willing to say that he had obtained a large amount of knowledge, and experience from the Vanguard Planet No. 4 relay station. It had diluted his anxious mood to a large degree. He even had the mood to consider. It was admittedly convenient to guide the believers of the Blood Flame Order through a ritual to converge their thoughts. But the collective model that he had seen so far wasn't considered too brilliant, especially when compared to the Heavenly Yuan Empire's military. But the environments of the two were different. Their natures weren't quite the same. Even if he wanted to improve it, there should be some differences from a standard array, but the more he thought, the more complicated things became. His mood, which had just eased up, tensed up once more. He had just returned to the space-time of Earth, but countless problems were already entangling him. If he wanted to complete every branch perfectly and flawlessly, then his brain would really explode. Unfortunately, this was reality. Luonan had to think of a way to coordinate and utilize every bit of power when facing an opponent whose strength was above his, as well as a large number of potential enemies. This was a completely different concept from when he was a small and insignificant maintenance soldier who obeyed orders in the relay station. Luonan shook his head and sat back on the tatami. He wanted to empty his mind, but then he heard familiar footsteps outside the cabin at this time. He didn't know why Lu, who had just ended the call, had come over. "Mr. Come in." Lu swept a glance at Snake Tongue out of habit after entering the room. She was a bit used to seeing this person's terrible state. Perhaps this person and Luonan were fated to clash? Li's gaze turned to Luonan. She was just about to speak when she was startled. She couldn't say what she was feeling. In short, there were some changes compared to when they spoke in the morning. Luonan had just sent the syncopator blueprints over. He saw her appearance and found it quite strange. Is something the matter? Lu hurriedly calmed her mind and lowered her head. I just contacted Master Shou. I've already sent the syncopator blueprints over. But Master Shou specifically mentioned that he wants to see you. He said that there are two matters. The first is to inquire about the usage of the second version of the exoskeleton frame. Well, I haven't had the time to try it out yet. Luonan's gaze shot to a corner of the cabin. There were 3 metal boxes placed side by side. Li's previous arrangement was still the same as before. I've also spoken to Master Shou about this, but he mentioned that his partner, Mrs. Jiang Zhong, also wants to meet with you, Mr. Jiang Zhong. She's the technical director of the Great Marsh Processing Factory. Luo Nan interrupted Yin Li's words. I know this person. She was among the people that Goto Masayoshi kidnapped that day. Luo Nan's memories flipped to the figure of that woman as he spoke. Most of the time, she was a quiet and low-key woman. She wasn't too eye-catching. Don't forget that Luo Nan spent most of his energy on the distant confrontation with the Pope and the true God. He also spent his energy on the high-level conference of the inner world that was convened at the same time. For him to be able to notice this person under those circumstances proved that this person possessed some sort of attractive quality that attracted his psychic senses. Or perhaps, replacing the word quality with inharmonious or doubtful point wouldn't be a problem. Luo Nan ran through the image of Jiang Zhong in his mind and asked Yinlo, did she say why she came looking for you? Yinlo shook her head slightly. Master Shou didn't speak in detail. He just said that she's a partner who advances and retreats together. She came to pay a visit. Normally, Yinlo could refuse, but she clearly understood that the veteran held a rather high position in Luo Nan's heart. There was no need to offend him for this sort of thing. Sure enough, Luo Nan didn't refuse. Okay. I have to give Master Shou face. Let her come. Let them come to the yacht? Luo Nan looked around. This place is pretty good. It's just outside in the living room. We can talk about the exoskeleton frame and the matter of the syncopator. It saves us the trouble of moving things around. Oh right, if it's convenient for Master Shou, let him bring over some processed skeletons. Yinlu bowed. Seeing that Luo Nan didn't have any further requests, she withdrew from the bedroom and went to make arrangements. Luo Nan looked at Snake Tongue. He saw that it would be hard for her to recover in a short time, so he didn't pay any more attention to her. He thought for a bit and walked to the location where the metal boxes were placed. He randomly picked one, placed it flat on the ground, and opened the lock. The space inside was opened up, and the exoskeleton frame, which was folded in a special manner, slowly stood up with a slow rhythm, revealing its complete structure. The toughness of the ox ghost skeletons and the shape memory function formed after first-rate processing were fully displayed. Luo Nan had his eyes on this point, so he let the veteran take charge of the syncopator production. This was the second version of the exoskeleton frame. It was designed before Luo Nan contended with the two powerful members of the Amaterasu order. Later on, Luo Nan redesigned the third version based on the injuries he received after the battle. Every design was an improvement. The improvement was just a bit too fast, so much so that the results of his thinking far exceeded the material supply. Hiss! Luo Nan suddenly sucked in a long breath. His reaction was a bit big. Even Snake Tongue, who was behind him, raised her head to look over. She saw Luo Nan smack his fist against his palm. He said hatefully, "It's getting rough again." Chapter 942. When Old Hand and Jiang Zhong stepped into the living room on the deck, they saw that the place had completely transformed into a workshop. On that day, Mr. M.O., who was thousands of miles away, had completely unfurled the 3-second edition exoskeleton frames while they were chatting and laughing merrily by the lakeside. One was placed in front of him. One was draped over his body. On the tatami mats and the table, there was a torn piece of clothing. The virtual work area had a rough outline of a structural design, as well as the sketches of various spare parts, modules, and so on. Aside from the main frame, everything else was switching at high speeds. It was a dazzling sight. Mr. M.O. himself appeared to be relatively calm. He crossed his arms in front of his chest, sat cross-legged, and gazed at the virtual work area. He didn't make any movements, but his eyeballs would occasionally swivel. He should be thinking. Jiang Zhong's gaze couldn't help but look around the living room, which had practically lost its ability to receive guests. Only then did he cast an inquiring gaze toward Old Hand. What he meant was, "Is this Mr. M.O. like this in private?" Old Hand nodded imperceptibly. At the very least, when they interacted normally, they mainly discussed technology and researched. Of course, perhaps he simply treated you as a technician. There was no need to bicker with you in other fields. Mr. Mo was extremely focused. He didn't pay attention to the two. Yin Lu, who had led them in, was not surprised by this sort of scene. She calmly found a place where she could stand and invited Old Hand and Jiang Zhong to take their seat. Since she still had matters to attend to, she excused herself and Mr. Mo left. Snake Tongue played the role of a maid. She offered short tables, tea, desserts, and so on to the two of them. Her attitude was humble, and her standards were rather high. She made up for Mr. Mo's arrogance that came from being overly focused. The two of them were somewhat overwhelmed by the favor. When they were seated, Jiang Zhong sensed that Mr. Mo's current attitude was a bit different from what he expected. He furrowed his brows as he pondered on how to cut in. As for Old Hand, he adapted to this situation much earlier than Jiang Zhong. He took a sip of tea, took out the bone material requested, and placed it on the short table. Snake Tongue came over on her own, took it, and sent it over to Luo Nan. After that, the veteran looked around the living room, especially the situation of the three exoskeletons in the living room. He tried to find clues in Mr. Mo's train of thought to prepare for future processing and adjustment. The first thing he noticed was a very strange detail. From his angle, he could see that Mr. Mo's body was actually in a semi-suspended state. He was supported by the exoskeleton frame, and there was a distance of nearly 10 centimeters between him and the tatami below. Looking at it in detail, the exoskeleton frame that was half hidden in the shadow of Luo Nan's body did not appear to be a stable and firm structure. Instead, it was in the midst of constant change. In front of him was the lower ring-shaped frame, and a second later, it turned into a drooping arm support joint. Next, it might be the half-disassembled load-bearing unit of the spine. Sometimes, even the veteran couldn't clearly see what it was. The only thing he could confirm was that these supporting points were all parts of the exoskeleton frame. They were under Mr. Mo's control, constantly mobilizing and adjusting. They were in a highly active state. Of course, the exoskeleton frame itself had a relatively fixed form. No matter how active it was, there was a limit. The changes had a boundary. And during the process of active switching, the frame would occasionally sway and lose balance. However, Mr. Mo was always able to quickly find a balance. Even if there was only a sharp point of contact, and the position was not in the center of gravity, it didn't stump him. The veteran seemed to understand something as he watched this scene. Mr. Mo opened his mouth to speak at this time. The balance test can be considered a good way to examine the physical structure of the exoskeleton system. It's simple and easy to use. It's not expensive. The veteran had already entered a state of mind. He leaned forward slightly and asked, "Then, do you think there are any problems with this version? I see that you've always been testing the flexibility of the mimicry changes. Is there a problem?" The problem isn't small. Luo Nan wore Mr. Mo's face and faced the cautious face of the veteran. He grinned and said, "But this is my problem. It's the problem of my eyes suddenly becoming sharper and sharper. In the eyes of the current Luo Nan, or to be exact, in the eyes of the Luo Nan who had gone through 70 hours of high-intensity training as a maintenance soldier in the repeater station of Planet Vanguard 4 and lived in actual combat, regardless of whether it was the second version that already possessed the actual object or the third version that was still in the state of a blueprint, the overall idea was that the mimicry transformation was the main functional requirement. It was possible to use it as an auxiliary line and mounting module to construct a perfect body. But there were far too many unsatisfactory areas on the level of detail. All the problems could be summed up in one point: crude. Too crude. The exoskeleton frame before Luo Nan's eyes had practically every design, every structure, every module, every accessory, and even the operational logic. It could be found in the enormous and rigorous creation system of the heavenly Yuan Empire. Moreover, it was a more perfect and mature plan. Actually, there was no need to flip through the database. Luonan had experienced the most commonly used classical structures under his high-intensity training. They far surpassed the exoskeleton in terms of stability and reliability. Even if there were material limitations and a certain degree of incomparability, the difference between the two was as great as the distance between Vanguard 4 and the Crimson Wheel Rift from the perspective of pure design philosophy. It didn't need to cross galaxies, but it should be measured in light years. Luonan's state of mind was quite good. He even patiently explained to the veteran, "The design of the actual object and the design of the configuration are different. This is an old truth, right? The problem is that I looked at it too shallowly before. Sinking from the configuration to the material plane and then completing the corresponding design of the actual object. There really is an enormous amount of knowledge involved." For example, instructor Xing Zhan of the repeater station. Half of his reputation as a master was bestowed upon him by his achievements in the sinking stage. This was an area that Luonan wasn't good at. The more ideal his configuration design was, the more eye-catching the whimsical aspects of the actual object's design would be. The majority of the reason why he was able to reach the standards of the second and third versions was the result of Dean Wan's forceful correction and leveling. Luonan had a general idea of this before, but there were many times when he couldn't change it. Now that he had the blessings of a maintenance soldier at the repeater station, he understood it even more clearly. He also had a clearer direction. Time was very tight. Wasting time was very shameful. But as long as there was a direction, everything was acceptable. Let's talk about the changes to the fourth version first. Why is it the fourth version? It's because the third version is dead in my mind. Luonan laughed out loud, proving that his mood was quite good. Part of it was to pacify the overly nervous mind of the veteran. The conflict by the lakeshore and the unforeseen changes in the background would more or less have an impact on them. Luonan had to take care of the veteran, who was friends with his grandfather, the veteran of the Hungduan 7 tribes. The veteran relaxed a bit, but he didn't dare to treat Luonan lightly. He turned on the recording function of his wristband and listened attentively. At this time, Jiang Zhong gave a slight bow and spoke softly. "Apologies. I'm going to the restroom." This was clearly to avoid arousing suspicion. Luonan didn't mind at first, but Jiang Zhong had the intention. He wouldn't refuse, so he nodded. Snake Tongue understood and went forward to greet him. Jiang Zhong had already stood up by now. He turned around and politely thanked Luonan before following Snake Tongue. A woman's time in the restroom could always be easily adjusted. She could look at herself in the mirror and touch up her makeup. It wasn't a problem for her to go from 5 minutes to 50 minutes. However, Jiang Zhong wasn't someone who was used to carrying cosmetics on her. She had come here today because she had heard the news from the veteran. The two of them directly left the workplace. She was only wearing her everyday light clothes. In the eyes of some people, this was already quite rude. Jiang Zhong just washed her face and stared blankly into the mirror. Several droplets of water splashed onto the surface of the mirror, reflecting an ordinary and intellectual face. Her eyes were dazed for a moment. Only then did he recognize that it was him. His fingers slid down from his cheeks, slowly moving to his neck, and then along his collarbone to his shoulder. On his thin and slightly stiff shoulder, he could feel the texture of the fabric, but there was also an additional force silently pulsating there. A rhythmic knocking sounded on the door. Jiang Zhong instantly came back to reality. He hastily wiped away the remaining droplets of water on his cheeks, adjusted his breathing, and opened the door. He spoke to Snake Tongue at the door. "Apologies. I've kept you waiting." Snake Tongue bowed slightly. She was still like a dutiful maid. However, the words that flowed from her lips and teeth at this moment had more or less surpassed her status. "Mrs. Jiang is quite familiar with the layout of this place." Jiang Zhong was a bit startled. He immediately replied, "It's because this yacht used to be under Mr. Matsudaira's name. I've come here a few times." "Yes, Mr. Matsudaira Yoshio is Mrs. Zhang's investor. Have the two of you known each other for a long time?" "Yes, quite a long time." Jiang Zhong unconsciously sighed as he spoke. "It looks like this is a story related to friendship. I spoke too much for a moment. Customer, please don't mind." Snake Tongue didn't say anything else. She took small, traditional steps and raised her hand to lead the way for Jiang Zhong. Soon, the two of them returned to the messy living room. Luonan and the veteran were already nearing the end of their conversation. "I need to finalize it within 6 hours. I know this isn't easy, but I still need to do it. Just like before, I'll first build a test machine. I'll pile one up regardless of the cost." Luonan really did have an urgent need for an exoskeleton frame. After all, the perfect body was the prerequisite for his current strongest state. Especially since his soul strength had been completely consumed and needed time to replenish, he needed to be by his side at all times. 6 hours. 6 hours it is. The veteran didn't know what sort of environment Luonan was in after he delivered the 3 exoskeleton frame version 2 equipment. He didn't know what sort of life Luonan had lived through, nor did he know what sort of challenges he would face in the future. But as he communicated with Mr. Mo, he gradually discovered that the small tacit understanding he had built up with Mr. Mo over the past few days was torn apart. He needed to wring his almost dry brain to squeeze out more nutrients to keep up with the pace of this powerful and mysterious client. His expression was a bit bitter right now, but the toughness he had polished in the wilderness prevailed. He gritted his teeth and agreed. "There's also the syncopator. This needs to be faster." During this time, Luonan had already seen the sample of the processed bones that the veteran had brought over. After Dean Wan's technological improvements, there were no problems applying it to the syncopator. And the classic design of the syncopator had its own blueprint, so he didn't need to worry about it. The matters related to production and manufacturing came to an end. With a slight thought, the deformed exoskeleton frame on his body was taken off. Snake Tongue came over to sort it out. Jiang Zhong had already taken his seat once more at this time. Luonan turned his face to face Jiang Zhong. He got straight to the point. "Director Jiang, you've been waiting for a long time. I heard that you were looking for me?" Jiang Zhong bowed. "Please forgive me for taking the liberty to disturb you, sir." Luonan laughed. "I wouldn't go so far as to disturb you." He sized up Jiang Zhong as he spoke. It was said that this woman was quite accomplished in the field of genome engineering. She was also engaged in experiments that violated ethics. No matter how one looked at her, she was an introverted and shy woman. She was a typical technician who wasn't good at socializing. The polite words at the tip of her tongue were stiff. For her to specially come looking for him under these circumstances could only mean that the matter she wanted to express was extremely important. At least this was the case for her. Luonan was a bit curious. He said, "I know that you and Master Shou are partners in close contact. With this layer of relationship, we don't need to be too polite. Just speak your mind and increase efficiency." "Yes. Thank you, Mr. Mo." Jiang Zhong took a deep breath and bowed once more. This time, the extent was even greater. "I've come this time in hopes of obtaining the tissue sample of Mr. Mo's summoned creature, the mushed-mouth ape. Please." Chapter 943. Jiang Zhong's voice trembled slightly at the end of her words, but the words that came out of her mouth were still expressed clearly. The most important thing was that the contents of her words were truly unexpected. Luonan never expected that she would make such a request. He subconsciously looked at the veteran. The veteran had just arranged a production task for the factory. He saw Mr. Mo cast a gaze at him. What else could he do but smile bitterly? This was interesting. Speaking of which, ever since Luonan publicly summoned the mushed-mouth ape, This was the first person to come knocking and ask for it. It must be known that this was a key target linked to the new plane. Who knew how many people were drooling over the idea of getting their hands on it? But they were intimidated by the power displayed by Mr. Mo, and the fact that the summoned creature came and went without a trace. They could only watch helplessly from the side. What kind of path did Jiang Zhong have? She actually came knocking on his door like this? Luonan felt that this was a bit absurd. He laughed and asked her, "Director Jiang, is this request of yours personal in nature or business?" "Personal," Jiang Zhong blurted out in response. "Oh, so it's like this." Luonan declined to comment. Luonan knew about the conversation between Snake Tongue and Jiang Zhong. Snake Tongue's actions were carried out under his tacit approval. However, this lady's position was far too vague. It was just like the appearance and temperament she displayed. They were separated by a layer of faintly discernible mist. It was like Luonan himself was covered by a veil of invisibility. Luonan decided to start with the most basic of questions. "Director Jiang, you've seen Yuan X." "Oh, this is what I call the mushed-mouth ape. You should have heard me say it when you were next to me. Its volume isn't small, but it's an energized existence. What do you mean by a tissue sample?" Jiang Zhong felt that she had already crossed a bottleneck when she wasn't blasted out by Mr. Mo on the spot. The nervousness in her heart eased a bit. She gently adjusted her breathing to make her voice a bit clearer. "Mr. Mo, it's like this. I observed the mushed-mouth ape back then. It possessed an overall structural stability on the material plane. I have mastered a technique that allows me to cut out a basic unit from the bottom of the structure. I can preserve the basic structural properties without damaging the entirety of the structure, and I can maintain it for a certain amount of time for research." Luonan was astonished. "You had ideas about it back then?" Jiang Zhong was a little embarrassed. He lowered his head and said, "I've considered it. After all, it's related to my research." Luonan ran a circle through his mind. It was said that different professions were worlds apart. He didn't quite understand what Jiang Zhong's so-called technology was. He also didn't know the specific contents of her research. He just felt that this didn't seem to be the field of genome engineering. "You're researching the mushed-mouth ape or a similar mutant?" It's hard to say if this thing is considered a mutant. According to his understanding of the lousy mouth ape, this kind of pure energy structure was more like an idealized collection of configurations. If he were to do it, he would have to start from the thinking of configurations and dismantle it from top to bottom or from bottom to top in order to keep the meaningful parts. Obviously, this was not going to be easy. From top to bottom, it was like decomposing a large number into prime factors with bare hand. At first glance, the principle seemed easy to understand, but when the quantity and complexity of the number exceeded the threshold, the human brain would explode. Going from the bottom to the top was very likely to get lost in the maze of the basic structure of the configuration, wasting brain time and energy, only to find that after going around in a circle, they were back to the starting point. What method did Jiang Zhong use to research? However, Jiang Zhong denied this aspect. "Ah, no. I'm not researching any type of mutant, but I do have a need to collect samples of diversity." Luonan was curious. "What kind of specific direction?" Jiang Zhong responded without the slightest hesitation. "The ecology of the distributed mutant gene network. It's the design of an ecological network built on the basis of genetic diversity. We hope to use the genes of mutants on a large scale as the basic level. We hope to stimulate a new and higher level through their sufficient connection, cooperation, learning, and competition, in the form of extraordinary power." Luonan frowned. "It sounds a bit like an artificial neural network." Actually, they both adopt the mathematical model of a sparse and distributed network. However, there will be differences in the application. The academic discussion stopped here. Luonan had no intention of getting too involved in this unfamiliar field. Otherwise, he might make a fool of himself. He caught onto another key word. You said we. This doesn't seem like a private request. Is the Songping Research Institute still operating? I remember that they've been selling their assets all this time. They feel that the limelight has passed, so they're starting to fill in again? Jiang Zhong was a bit nervous when she saw Luonan's doubt. She explained, I don't understand the operation of the Great Zhe Order. I'm asking for a tissue sample for the sake of the following research. Of course, it has nothing to do with the Great Zhe Order. As far as I know, the research institute you're in is privately funded by Matsudaira Yoshio. This research project. I brought it with me. Jiang Zhong's rebuttal blurted out, but there was a stumble in the middle. It dispelled her emotions more or less. Then her voice weakened a bit, but it was still a lot harder than before. I've already signed an agreement with the Research Institute. They've only obtained the patent related to the field of directional induction for this project. The rest is still with me. That should be the most valuable part. Research results often keep a distance from should. Veteran coughed over and over to the side. Jiang Zhong finally came to her senses. Her emotions had gotten to her head. Her face was a bit pale. She tried to apologize, but she didn't know what to say for a time. On the other side, Luonan saw that Jiang Zhong was so nervous that her fists were clenched, but her body movements were still forcefully not falling apart. The key thing was that veteran was smiling at the side. He looked at Luonan with an impatient expression. Luonan's heart softened, and he eased up with a sentence. Never mind. I'm not interested in how you guys sign the agreement. If it's the employer behind you, it'll be a bit interesting. Employer? Jiang Zhong was still too nervous, so much so that she was a bit slow. Veteran comforted her again. Mr. Mo, are you talking about the LCRF? Jiang Zhong immediately reacted. Indeed, with the level of strength displayed by Mr. Mo, the size of the Great Zhe Order was indeed not within the scope of his attention. Those that could be linked to him were certainly of a higher level. For example, behind Matsudaira Yoshio's private research institute was an even larger investment organization, the LCRF, which was also known as the Life Cycle Research Fund. Luonan had diverted the topic. Veteran was naturally willing to cooperate. He intentionally used chatter to ease up the atmosphere. I'd say that the LCRF isn't very interested in Jiang Zhong's research. The uncertainties are too strong, and it's a long and drawn-out project. It's been over 20 years from the beginning until now. It's not that there aren't any results, but there hasn't been a single person who's been able to prolong their lives. Those fellows who are older and weaker than me are probably just waiting to die if they really rely on this. The rest of them can't wait any longer. Veteran laughed heartily as he spoke. Luonan laughed as well. What the veterans were referring to was the mockery of the ability users' sense of superiority towards the previous generations, who had great capital and power but could not activate supernatural powers, and ended up kneeling before diseases and death and weeping their hearts out. He spoke again. From the Wilderness Laboratory to Quantum Corporation, they've been fighting for 3 days even if they don't have dates. They're really going crazy from hunger. Luonan added in his mind, from the safe trade zone of Ban City to the deep blue world. Ever since the era of distortion, especially after the appearance of powerful mythical existences like ability users and extraordinaries, those in power who were unable to catch up were driven mad with jealousy on one hand. On the other hand, they discovered the hope of prolonging their lives and vitality. Under the provocation of hope, a considerable portion of this group of people lost their composure. They did things more and more aggressively, disregarding everything. The LCRF was one of the batons they used to wield the power of capital. They had become more and more anxious in the past few years. At the same time, Luonan discovered a few emotional triggers from veterans' words. Master Shou has had dealings with the LCRF before? Me? I don't have the qualifications. I've just seen a few things. It's all from a long time ago. In the past. It was when we were in the wilderness. It's a pity that it doesn't seem like friendship. Luonan's mind suddenly froze when he spoke to this point. He felt that it was a bit familiar. He looked at Jiang Zhong across from him, and remembered that this was a bit similar to the words Snake Tongue had said to him a few minutes ago. The trigger was friendship, but the keyword was a time expression like in the past. Luonan's eyes narrowed. He paid attention to it in secret, but he didn't delve deeper into this field. He just casually made a summary. The claws of capital really are unfathomable. Veteran laughed. Clearly, Mr. Mo had forgotten that he controlled the Blood Flame Order and the Castle Financial Group, which was even more famous in the secular world. They were also outstanding and famous capital powers. From this, it could be seen that Mr. Mo didn't place his position on the side of capital. This was in line with his usual behavior, making Veteran feel closer to him. He wanted to strike while the iron was hot and help Jiang Zhong speak up. But Mr. Mo shook his head. Honestly speaking, Director Zhang's research project has nothing to do with me. But if it involves the mushed-mouth ape, this very moment is far too sensitive. Veteran had already automatically entered the role of a lobbyist. He humbly asked for guidance. You're saying, I don't know how much you guys understand about this matter, but the current public situation is this. The mushed-mouth ape is involved in the secrets of a new plane. If its tissue sample can really be dismantled and leaked out— Luonan raised his hand to stop Jiang Zhong's inclination to swear an oath. I'm saying that even if only the news is leaked out, who knows what those fellows who stare at the new plane day in and day out to the point that their eyes turn green from staring at it. Luonan cast his gaze at Jiang Zhong. Think about it. If you get this tissue sample, maybe when you get off the yacht, that go to Masayoshi, even if he doesn't exist, there can still be Satoshi Maitu, Renswudding, and so on. They can invite you onto the yacht and send you directly to the Amaterasu court. He was joking, but Jiang Zhong and the veteran couldn't bring themselves to laugh. Luonan sighed when he saw their expressions. Looking at it from a different angle, Luonan really wanted to know whether or not the scientific research institutions of Earth could explore deeper secrets from the mushed-mouth ape's research, secrets that even he couldn't touch. Yes, he already knew that the cloud world was the product of the interaction between the mist labyrinth and Earth's local spacetime. He even wanted to borrow this basic logic for the virtual plane he would create in the future in order to quickly take shape. But why would a strange species like the mushed-mouth ape appear in the basic and clear structure of the cloud world? This was still an unsolved mystery. If he had a trustworthy research team under his command, he would have given it away by now. President Ouyang's side was actually pretty good. But it was just as he said before. It was unknown how big of a storm would be stirred if news were to leak out in this sensitive period. Luonan's mind stirred slightly when he thought of this. Another thought popped up in his mind. It seemed that stirring up a storm wasn't bad at all. He was somewhat unable to suppress this thought as soon as it appeared. But now wasn't the time to think things through in detail. Luonan retracted his attention and faced Veteran once more. Jiang Zhong's expression grew all the more amiable. I discovered this thing by accident. It's not bad to be able to research and discover its deep secrets. However, now clearly isn't the time. Jiang Zhong was already thrown into chaos by Luonan's hot and cold attitude. He even doubted the correctness of his request. He looked over in a daze when he heard Luonan's words. Luonan didn't beat around the bush with her. Let's postpone it for a few days. In the society of commodities, time nodes and sequence are the most suitable for marking prices. A step earlier or a step later will make a huge difference. You guys don't seem to be in a rush to get started right now? Yes. This is a part of the collection. It's used for high-level comparison groups. Jiang Zhong suddenly understood when he spoke to this point. Mr. Mo had agreed. It didn't matter if it was due to the face of Veteran or some delaying tactic. For a powerful person of Mr. Mo's status, a promise was certainly better than nothing. Even if she wasn't able to take it back today, it would still be a consolation. A joyous expression appeared on her face. She got up from her seat and bowed deeply in thanks. But she heard Mr. Mo ask a question before she could say words of thanks. "What's your segmentation tool?" Sorry. I'm talking about the collection tool." Luo Nan clearly used the segmentation tool to his heart's content. Speaking of which, he really did want to use the segmentation tool to cut it and see what the result would be. Unfortunately, he didn't have an advanced artificial intelligence like Aunt Kuei. He also didn't have the enormous database accumulated by the Heavenly Yuan Empire. It would be quite difficult to make a comparison. While he was fantasizing, Jiang Zhong answered without the slightest hesitation, "It's a supernatural power that I possess. It's called dissociation." Luo Nan was a bit surprised. Jiang Zhong really didn't have the slightest hint of an ability user. Even though he could sense a few characteristics, it was very easy to forget or overlook them. Jiang Zhong didn't have the slightest intention of keeping it to himself. He explained seriously, "My ability is mainly used to strip complex systems. It's used to generate reactions to stimuli from the external environment. However, it is limited by the complexity and precision of the system and unit." "Can you demonstrate it?" "Of course." Jiang Zhong immediately agreed. Since he was going to experiment, he obviously needed a target. What should he use? Luo Nan's gaze swept over Snake Tongue, but he soon shifted it away. She had enough bad luck these past few days, and she was in front of others. It would be good to give her a bit of face. He himself wasn't suitable. Veteran was a guest. He couldn't really bring out Yuan X. Luo Nan's thoughts spun a few times, and he came up with a plan. He snapped his fingers. "It'll be this little thing. Sorry for my lack of manners." As Jiang Zhong spoke, a fingernail-sized large ant-like life form appeared on the short table in front of him. It swaggered over. Its entire body was scarlet red, and it reflected the lighting in the living room. It seemed to sparkle with a flame-like luster. Vulcan ant. This was a Vulcan ant that had been transported over from a Vulcan ant nest several thousand kilometers away in the lava caverns. This was a magical technique, and it possessed an inconceivable core. In any case, Veteran and Jiang Zhong were both stupefied as they watched. Luo Nan let out a secret sigh of relief after finishing this task. Right now, the range of his soul cloak had shrunk completely. It couldn't even cover the entire civilian market. The altar's spiderweb was a bit rotten, and he needed the wraith sign to work anew to mend it. However, his soul strength was still rapidly proliferating under the special structure of formatting theory. It was far beyond the reach of normal ability users, and it was endlessly recovering. Moreover, his control over the targets he had previously controlled didn't decline at all. This reflected the stability of the dark chains, a fundamental ability. Completing this fixed-point transmission basically clarified the bottom line of his strength. Back to the matter at hand. The Vulcan ant was a social mutant species. It was controlled, small in size, and simple in internal structure. It was quite suitable to be used as a target for a demonstration. Luo Nan looked at Jiang Zhong, but Jiang Zhong was stupefied. Is it too small?" No. I've done it before." Jiang Zhong raised his head and quickly swept a glance over. Then he lowered his eyelids. His breathing and heartbeat were a bit chaotic, but he still extended his hand toward the Vulcan ant. The large ant, which seemed to be flowing with a bloody glow, followed along Jiang Zhong's finger under Luo Nan's telepathic command. Climbed all the way up and quickly climbed to the hollow of her palm. Jiang Zhong adjusted her breathing once more. Then she closed her palm and fingers, then separated them a moment later. During this time, the Vulcan ant didn't attack her under Luo Nan's control. It was as if it had completed a checkout mission. It climbed down without any abnormalities. "It's done." Jiang Zhong's voice was a bit shaky. Perhaps it was due to the consumption of energy from using her ability. The veteran to the side had already seen this sort of scene many times. He coughed and wanted to open his mouth to explain. But Luo Nan didn't need this. He had already captured the undetectable red dot in the hollow of Jiang Zhong's palm through his keen perception. This is a parasol sac? From the perspective of the mutant Vulcan ant, the parasol sac was no longer a place to store food. Instead, it was an existence that had mutated into an ammunition warehouse. The semi-finished neurotoxin stored here could form a powerful zombie virus that dominated the target's nervous system through mixing with the secretions from the gland, tail, and other different areas. It could also be used as a stimulant to stimulate the individual's energy. At the same time, it was an important additive for the pheromone needed for collective activities. It could be said to be one of the most critical organs. Luo Nan looked at the Vulcan ant on the short table. It was actually at a loss. Luo Nan nearly applauded. What a marvelous displacement! Upon closer examination, there should be some subtle space-time-related elements within. But the most marvelous part was the instantaneous deconstruction and reorganization of the local tissue. Unfortunately, the details were quite chaotic. There seemed to be quite a bit of redundancy. It was yet another black box. Over on Earth, as long as supernatural powers were involved, many had the characteristics of a black box. They knew how, but they didn't know why. In the end, it was because the structure wasn't systematic and the research wasn't deep enough. In any case, this was a very interesting ability. If used properly, it could even be a very terrifying ability. Luo Nan felt that he didn't lose out by being able to see this demonstration. Chapter 944. Old Hand and Jiang Zhong left. As they exited the cabin, they bumped into Yin Lo, who had sent them over. Yin Lo politely wanted to send them off the airship, but they refused. Basically, the two bid farewell in a calm mood. This was in line with Luo Nan's expectations. Sir's heart is too good. Yin Lo said this as soon as she entered. She was suspicious of flattery, but part of it was from the bottom of her heart. She hesitated for a moment before saying, "The human heart is subtle. If Sir's attitude is too kind, it might not be a good thing for them." Luo Nan was arranging the parts around him, trying to piece them back together. He didn't even raise his head when he heard this. Master Shou isn't that kind of person. As for Jiang Zhong, he doesn't seem like one either. His words were uncertain, but his tone was flat. This was because this wasn't the main point of Luo Nan's attention. In comparison, he felt that the relationship between the two was more worth exploring. The friendship between Master Shou and Jiang Zhong is extremely deep. It's not at the level of an ordinary collaborator. Yin Lo pulled out the relevant information. Yes, it's closer than what the information shows. However, Master Shou's Hengduan 7 tribes has a much more tense relationship with Jiang Zhong. Their relationship with Jiang Zhong is the relationship between a researcher and a lab rat. A considerable number of people have a very bad impression of Jiang Zhong. On the day she and Master Shou were kidnapped, some people even suspected that it was a trick she played. Luo Nan's hands didn't stop assembling. He just spoke a bit slower. Under normal logic, even if the researcher felt pity for the lab rat, it's unlikely that the researcher would develop a friendship and relationship with the lab rat. That would be far too difficult. But the facts are there. How did this friendship come about? And when did it come about? Yin Lo roughly grasped Luo Nan's train of thought. She tried to make a judgment. If we exclude some complex physiological and psychological factors, pushing the time forward is more logical. This is before the Hengduan 7 tribes became living materials. They moved to Ban City in the first place to become living materials. Nominally, it was to provide social relief to the nomadic tribes of the wilderness that had suffered from the mutant infection. But in reality, everyone was clear. The research organization of Ban City's trade market wouldn't give them the time and space to make friends. Then we can only push it forward. The wilderness, Luo Nan said. Enlo quickly brought up the corresponding information. According to the information from the Great Zhe cult, there are rumors that Jiang Zhong was born in the wilderness. At least in the processing plants and research institutes, most people think so. Wilderness. This is the wilderness. Luonan paused his assembling actions for a moment. Then he casually swept his hand and cleared the table in front of him, letting the spare parts scatter to the ground. Then, he took a fake vertebra joint used on load-bearing ridges and placed it in the middle of the table. What we can be 100% sure of is that before Master Shou came to Ban City, he was in the wilderness in Spring City, near the Hengduan mountain range. If Jiang Zhong got to know him in the wilderness, it's most likely here. Luonan placed another bionic joint on the table, placing it together with the one representing the veteran. He thought for a bit and separated them a bit. Using a veteran to anchor Jiang Zhong and her range of activities was a little arbitrary, Enlo continued. The same source of information indicates that the president of the Dazawa Society, Matsudaira Yoshio, is a close friend of Jiang Zhong, and it might even be a little ambiguous. The beginning of this relationship should also be in the wilderness. Matsudaira Yoshio, huh? Luonan had seen Matsudaira Yoshio's information before. It seemed that Matsudaira Yoshio was a powerful character, but Luonan's impression of Matsudaira Yoshio was still fuzzy in his mind. What attracted Luonan's attention was that Matsudaira Yoshio had once roamed the wilderness for a considerable amount of time. It was just that Matsudaira Yoshio was very secretive about where he went and what he did. Then again, no matter what sort of person Matsudaira Yoshio was, the friendship forged between him and Jiang Zhong in that complicated and dangerous environment had been tempered for so many years. Most likely, it was true friendship. He swept a glance at Snake Tongue. There was still another piece of circumstantial evidence for this matter. Luonan's thoughts entered a state of linear deduction. A long time ago, a friend in the wilderness. There were far too many possibilities in terms of specific locations without the anchor point of veteran. However, if Old Hand was added, Luonan would have to seek an intersection, and the range would suddenly narrow. But then, Luonan picked up another bionic joint and placed it on the table. Could Matsudaira Yoshio and veteran be old acquaintances? There's no evidence to prove this. Yeah. Wouldn't the relationship be too complicated if he followed this line of deduction? Could it be that Jiang Zhong and even Matsudaira Yoshio were old acquaintances? Luonan grasped the bionic joint in the palm of his hand and flipped through the external neuron to search for information. In the past, He Wayne had recently asked Enlo to search the information market for some information regarding his grandfather Luo Yuandao's scientific research ethics case. He would flip through it when he had nothing to do. Unsurprisingly, there were no records of any connection, and this was the most detailed information Luonan could find in the early days. As for the wilderness laboratory stage, it was the late 70s and early 80s. The world government was still in a difficult strategic defense phase against the mutants in the wilderness. They had practically no influence over the refugee powers. Even the intelligence organizations of the inner world didn't have many methods to deal with the chaotic and bloody wilderness. It was very difficult to gather intelligence. After going back and forth many times, Luonan felt that it would be better to listen to his aunt Luo Shuqing's memories. Forget it. I'll just pay attention for now. Luonan placed the third bionic joint on the edge of the table. He played it down on the surface, but he had already made a decision in his heart. He would wait until his mental plane's condition had more or less recovered. He would start from this angle and completely monitor Jiang Zhong and Matsudaira Yoshio's movements. Or he could simply draw up psychic diagrams and attempt divination. He could see if he could erase the uncertainties from the perspective of supernatural powers. Oh, speaking of psychic diagrams, why did he come to Ban City in the first place? With a thought, the exoskeleton frame's contents automatically switched out in Luonan's virtual workspace. What replaced it was Luo Nan's newest work in Xia City. It was on this psychic diagram that the luxurious jadeite light cruise ship was tapped, and a certain image was drawn. Lu knew that Luo Nan was deep in thought. She carefully controlled her breathing for fear of disturbing him. It was just that every time Luo Nan was deep in thought, there would always be some abnormalities around him. This time, aside from the contents of the virtual workspace being switched, the 3 bionic joints on the table were rolling under the influence of some invisible power until they spun and spun. There was also a blood-red ant the size of a thumb. It seemed to be the one that had been used as an experimental subject just now. It had crawled back from the opposite table. Unfortunately, its luck tonight was abysmal. It had just climbed onto the table when it was run over by a rolling bionic joint. Perhaps it hid its vitals? In any case, it immediately erupted with a blood-colored flame and was burned to ashes. Luo Nan's gaze locked onto the fire of the fire god ant that exploded and then extinguished, as well as the remaining ashes. He appeared to be deep in thought. And at this time, Lu noticed that Snake Tongue was silently retreating. Her eyebrows were knitted together, as if she had encountered some problem. Oh. There were some fluctuations in the mental domain. What's the matter? Even Lu noticed the abnormality on the mental plane. There was no need to talk about Luo Nan. He even confirmed the source of the disturbance. His gaze turned to Snake Tongue, and her figure paused. She lowered her eyes and said softly, "Reporting to my lord. It's Zhuo Jiawei calling for help." Luo Nan had been staying at the trade market for the past few days, which was also the northern shore of Northern Mountain Lake. He had nearly completely forgotten about the big guy on the southern shore. But when Snake Tongue mentioned it, the image of the giant camphor tree spirit immediately appeared in his mind. Calling for help. Oh, I nearly forgot. What's the situation like with the powers of the Order of Ban City these past 2 days? Lu replied, "They're all unsettled. The Fusang Divine Tree System revealed itself that day, and it scared quite a few people. Plus, everyone says that the true God is in a terrible mood these past 2 days. There are a few more venting barrels and scapegoats in the dark." They're just venting barrels? Luo Nan didn't believe it at all. Speaking of which, what in the world were the Pope and the true God going to set up in Ban City? What were they cooking? The current Luo Nan's insight and knowledge were different from when he first arrived in Ban City. It didn't matter if they were aberrations or whatever. They were born with a spirit, received the power of faith, and could operate and evolve. This was already in the category of fantasy breed. It wasn't just the Zhuo Jiawei men. According to the taxonomy of species of the Heavenly Yuan Empire, the so-called gods consecrated by the thousands of orders of Order of Ban City could be classified into the category of fantasy breeds. Yes, that's right. In the standard sense, fantasy breeds referred to creatures that didn't have a natural material foundation. They were pure creations of consciousness, desire, and information. However, in the actual process of development, there would often be a trigger in the distorted process of desire and cognition. There were also such examples on Earth, including mountains, rivers, trees, rocks, birds and beasts, natural phenomena, and even ancient sages and heroes. All of these could become the cornerstone of faith. Of course, this was just the initial stage of fantasy breed. Truly powerful fantasy breeds would inevitably break away from the shackles of concrete objects, physical properties, and images. They would expand their domain of influence as much as possible. For example, the magnetic optical mica. Its original form was very likely to be a white cloud that could be entrusted with one's imagination. However, in the long process of evolution and growth, it accepted more and more elements of imagination and desire from trillions of intelligent life forms. In the end, it was fixed on the space-time element of imagination. It was said that one could see 10,000 kilometers away and wish to fall beyond the heavens. There were also studies that showed that the original form of the magnetic optical mica was an experimental configuration invented by a powerful existence. It was just that it took the shape of a white cloud. Only with an extraordinary foundation could it possess a variety of terrifying abilities that were powerful and extraordinary. Of course, this wasn't within the development of fantasy breeds. Speaking of experiments, Enlil and Snake Tongue were ruthlessly abandoned by Luo Nan's train of thought. Luo Nan didn't pay attention to them. He just thought that he seemed to have heard Liang Lu mention something before. In history, fantasy breeds were indeed extremely important research targets. They were a kind of special transitional element. They themselves had an extremely important meaning. A few relatively clear concepts spun in his mind, and he suddenly hit a certain trigger point. The external neuron's built-in database search function was activated. One professional thesis after another and arranged neatly appeared in Luo Nan's sea of consciousness. Why wasn't he this sensitive in the past? Luo Nan brought back his past self and felt sour about his present self. But after thinking a bit more, he felt that it was reasonable. This sort of telepathic trigger function. If he didn't have the abyss of heaven style of thought, how could the abyss of heaven style of thinking be realized? The most important thing was the content of the relevant materials. Luo Nan relied on the translation function of his secret glyph to hastily sweep through them. At least within the scope of his field of vision, the topics were different. The keywords and introductions were more or less repetitive. Aside from the words fantasy breed, magnetic optical mica, and so on, there were other words like system, kingdom of God, medium, precondition, and so on. Did I search them? Luo Nan's gaze fell upon the article at the very top of the list. Configuration, faith, and great limit. The rational reconstruction of historical evolution from ignorance to dawn. The magnetic optical mica chapter. Oh, I feel like this is a large work. A part of it. Luo Nan noticed this. Aside from being at the very top of the list, there was also the word configuration at the very top. But before he could translate the introduction a step further, he first noticed the author. This was a name that he wasn't familiar with, but he was rather sensitive to some time ago. Azure and Blue. Jean. Holy crap. Chapter 945. Jean He, the Lord of Jean He. For Luo Nan, who had just left the relay station, this was already a symbolic name. It was the most important landmark in the history of the Heavenly Yuan Empire. There was no other. Luo Nan's knowledge of the Lord of Jean He's life was still rather vague due to the severe limitations of his knowledge regarding sacrifice. All he knew was that he was the founder of the Heavenly Yuan Empire, one of the most powerful beings in the universe. In fact, in the history of the Heavenly Yuan Empire, there was nothing wrong with the label of the Lord of Jean, he being the most powerful being. Luo Nan's lack of knowledge regarding the history of the Heavenly Yuan Empire could only allow his thoughts to diverge to this degree. It was quite impossible for his eyes to be brimming with tears for the legacy of the founding emperor. Then, he thought of something more realistic. Authority. Such a character. Such a large card. The external neuron's strict authority settings. Were there no restrictions in this aspect? Luo Nan didn't feel that there were too many authority restrictions in the relay station. It wasn't that the restrictions were loose. Instead, within the precise and complete system, many meaningless reminders or obstacles had already become formless. If you couldn't see it, then you couldn't see it. Basically, you wouldn't be given a corresponding mission. However, Luo Nan had soaked in it for a long time. He had a certain understanding of the authority of the Heavenly Yuan Empire. It could be said that there were differences in levels. From Luo Nan's perspective, the social hierarchy and authority system of the Heavenly Yuan Empire was a rather typical multi-channel model. Within the strict hierarchical division, several specialized channels were opened to allow them to operate in parallel. The most common ones included the nobility system, the professional system, and the knowledge system. Some of these were specialized nouns. Luonan could only roughly translate and understand them. Officer, officer, nobility. These were the system of military service officials. Bachelor, technician, teacher. These were the system of social professions. General, specialist, heaven ladder. These were the system of academic knowledge. Basically, they were all rank 3, rank 9. In addition, there was a series of complicated cultivation orders. But in general, they could be summarized into 3 stages. Namely, internal cultivation, smelting, and innovation. Mentally, Luonan corresponded them with the awakened, architect, and extraordinary of the inner world system. These channels were either parallel or intersecting. Together, they formed the solid talent structure and knowledge system of the heavenly Yuan Empire, as well as strict value judgments. The knowledge of configuration and creation that Luonan had learned was incorporated into it. Each had a precondition and a continuation, forming a complete hierarchy of learning and research. The special point here was that the innovation in the cultivation system was often confused with the ladder to heaven in the academic knowledge system. The reason for this was that the first level of the celestial stairway was the most special. It was a stage of innovation in learning and cultivation, and it was the exploration and summary of the Dharma and Logos of the universe. It was boundlessly profound, and it wasn't something that could be covered by just 3 levels. Therefore, every 100 years, the ranking of the heaven stairway would be discussed by the various academies and research institutes of the heavenly Yuan Empire. Then, the Senate would decide whether to increase or decrease the ranking. Ever since the establishment of the heavenly Yuan Empire, the heaven stairway had grown from the most primitive 3 steps to the 13 steps that Luonan knew of. It had grown by a full 10 step. Every increase in level represented great progress in the research and cultivation system of the Imperium. Moreover, it was said that almost the same number of times of reduction was hidden within, further proving the solid and rigorous side of this system. And above this ranking system was the level of Grand Monarch. The reason why it transcended above was because the level of Grand Monarch was the true transcendent realm, the immortal power, and the study that transcended limits. Aside from a portion of knowledge laws that were integrated into the 13 steps of the heaven stairway, the general cultivation order and standards were already quite different from the understanding of ordinary people. Luonan had yet to come into contact with the specific content, so he had no way of talking about it. From this point of view, the initial privileges of the external neuron were set at the NCO rank for resource transfer and expert-level knowledge search. This was already a mid-level authorization. Most of the high-level knowledge that Luonan had come into contact with at the relay station was at this level. As for after passing the offline test, his knowledge access had risen to the 4th level of the celestial ladder, and what he had access to was already common knowledge that only teachers, dignitaries, and at the very least, elite officers had. Well, of course, special talents like Lieutenant Loaned were a different story. As for the domain involved in the 2 privileges, resource transfer and such, he was still muddle-headed. It seemed that it was related to the virtual brain systems analysis and the inner universe's simulator. Comparatively speaking, pure knowledge search was the most suitable for the current Luonan. In any case, according to Luonan's understanding of the ranking system of the heavenly Yuan Empire, the NCO rank and the heaven stairway rank were all fine. No matter how much one raised one's rank, they were still on the ordinary level within the heavenly Yuan system. They were in the domain of comprehensible. Once they were linked to Lord Zhan He, they would instantly rise to an inconceivable level. Even though this thesis with a rather long title appeared to be only a portion of some great work, it seemed to be some thesis or teaching material upon closer inspection. There were elements of imparting knowledge, but was it really possible? It should be possible, Luonan said to himself. The privileges of the external neuron were both restrictions and insurance. So far it seemed that other than blocking him, testing him, and making things difficult for him, the external neuron basically maintained a good level of security. As for the others, according to Luo Nan's personal understanding and experience, he could clearly sense and understand the information on the level of information search and integration. Even though he only saw the title, the most important thing was that it had already come to this. What was he hesitating for? Luo Nan pondered and hesitated. In the end, he had the external neuron report that his privileges were insufficient. That would truly be a joke. Luo Nan laughed to himself. His mind relaxed, and his telepathic thoughts touched the results of the search. He tried to flip through the information on Lord John He's article like he did with the lamination interference technology. Luo Nan's consciousness became slightly dazed in the next second. A pop-up window appeared on the virtual brain interface, but it passed in a flash. It seemed as if nothing had happened, and this work, elaborated by the highest-level author, had already been released to Luo Nan. He thought that he would have to read, translate, understand, and so on, but there was none. Only bright sparks of electricity suddenly flashed within the haze of the mental plane. Right now, Luo Nan's mental plane was filled with haze. The corrosive process of the sunwheel absolute hell and the sinful poison pollution was still ongoing, forming an endless dense fog. The imitation show of the heavily chained crow and the wraith sign was also gradually entering a fine state. Bright red light seeped through the depths of the chaotic fog, faintly illuminating the outline and some fragments. When the article transformed into zigzagging lightning and pierced into the fog, it collided with the chaotic scene. But there was no conflict. Instead, it was simply projected. It was like a unique printing machine. It used the fog as a medium to brush out group after group of bizarre graphic symbols. It looked like that Luo Nan had inexplicably grasped. The secret sign was a combination of the central region's pictograms and highly generalized symbols. It was as if they came from the same source. There was no doubt that Luo Nan could not understand a single one of them. Even if he had the secret sign to translate, he would not be able to understand them in a short amount of time. But during this process, he vaguely grasped a few things behind the scenes. The main thing was the external neuron that carried and activated the electricity. It was a few fragments of the operation of the black box. More accurately speaking, it was configuration, faith, and the great limit. A rational reconstruction of the evolution of history from ignorance to dawn. The magneto-optic mica chapter. This article had already transformed into electricity, and its source of information. This was because, even at this time, the electro-optic printer was still drawing an endless stream of information from many channels and many directions. The information was then transformed into strange characters and symbols that filled the sky. Aside from the external neuron, there was also the half-decayed altar spiderweb, and even the sunwheel absolute hell. A considerable portion of this work of the Lord of Deep Harmony was actually extracted and precipitated from the flood of information from the sunwheel absolute hell. This, it was no wonder. It turned out that a considerable part of this content was completed from the outside world. At the very least, from Luo Nan's understanding of the situation, the external neuron's database didn't have an absolute advantage. Thus, the external neuron's own authority system was unable to restrain Luo Nan. It tacitly agreed that Luo Nan possessed the relevant authority. The number of electro-optic characters increased endlessly. But as the density increased, the flavor of the characters and symbols grew fainter and fainter. Instead, the appearance of a configuration design was vividly displayed. What followed was an even more concrete and detailed physical structure. From the characters to the configuration. From the configuration to the physical. From the abstract to the concrete. As he explored step by step, Luo Nan's consciousness began to dance along with it. In his days, it was as if he had once again experienced the 70 hours of his life at the relay station. But this time, the focus was different. His consciousness left the base and entered the vaster world. He looked at the towering structure of clouds that was like a ship and a mountain. He looked at how it made adjustments, how it summoned the Hellfire Tyrant, and how it mobilized its military forces. Of course, there was also the image of the Hellfire Tyrant, but it was much more blurry. In this way, not a single one of the three parties that clashed at the relay station was missed. They all fell into Luo Nan's eyes, allowing him to observe them from a comprehensive and objective perspective. Luo Nan had similar experiences during his offline tests, but he didn't understand them as clearly as he did now. In the end, Backtrack concluded with the exceptionally clear shadow cockroach. What was this? How could Luo Nan see the logic in this instant? But he faintly sensed that he could only approach things from the perspective of concrete images. The deeper level of jurisprudence might be fatal. Luo Nan found a good analogy. He was like Yin-Lu, Snake Tongue, and Cat Eyes of the past. He had entered a movie theater to experience the unfathomable demonstration of the rules. The movie finally came to an end. The lights lit up, but Luo Nan discovered that this wasn't a movie theater. He didn't return to that bewildering, chaotic, and foggy environment. His consciousness had actually led him into a grand and imposing hall. He couldn't see the structure of the palace too clearly. All he knew was that it was inconceivably vast and grand. There were no pillars or shadows blocking the way at all. All he could see were the numerous statues scattered about. There was also mist and mist circulating within. Some of these statues were far away. Some were close. Some were blurry. Some were clear. Some were simply the mist itself. They would suddenly coalesce into form and then vanish into thin air. Chapter 946. It seems to be quite advanced. Right now, Luo Nan could calmly face all sorts of unexpected situations. Could there be a scene more inconceivable than this seemingly real relay station? His consciousness remained within the misty palace. He did not rush to a conclusion. Instead, he quietly waited, sensed, and observed this palace. In the end, he saw the origin of this palace and what it was supported by. Luo Nan observed for a period of time due to his limited cracking of the black box of the external neuron. He was basically certain that this misty palace was a product of information aggregation. It was just countless complex information and data that followed some mechanism to produce an image projection on the mental plane. This was not a preset program of the external neuron. It was more like Luo Nan was in full contact with the flood of information and data through multiple channels. It was a foundation of mutual compromise and passive choice. First was the hairy embryo formed from the aggregation of information structures. According to Luo Nan's current understanding, every information channel represented a type of information structure. The external neuron was the systematic storage of data. The Sunwheel Absolute Hell was the aggregation model of the shattered rules and information. The evil poison was a negative state that severely distorted the rules and information. There was also the alter spider web. It was a kind of intermediate state where information was transmitted, received, precipitated, and selected. The elements inside were even more complex. There were even millions and millions of living beings that had shallow or deep involvement and influence. It could be said that it was the place where the greatest variable was born. When they collided together, it would be fine if it was just a simple flow of information. It was very likely that they would influence and pollute each other. In the end, they would become completely chaotic and become meaningless noise. The problem was that these completely different information structures possessed rather stubborn and established patterns, yet they possessed a similar foundation in a certain sense. They possessed a relatively unified source, and the effects and infiltration they carried out on each other possessed the meaning of order and rules. Luo Nan could understand and utilize them. Luo Nan believed that this was a good phenomenon. It had great potential. Perhaps in the future, when he encountered more similar channels or information structures, he could handle them according to the rules and form a pattern? There was nothing much to say about the more specific things. This was because what drove these information channels to fully combine was an academic article written by Master Zhanhe with an extremely long title. This could be considered a half-formed mold placed there. It naturally gathered and carried the powder of information. Even 1 out of 10,000 was enough to knead a hairy embryo from within. Well, the process of information structures permeating each other was more interesting. Next was the hairy embryo that Luo Nan had created himself. This was the process of becoming more and more familiar with the flow. Luo Nan was the central axis where all information converged. He was the small wooden stick that produced cotton candy. He stirred within the flood of information, allowing the chaotic information to interweave and form a shape that held fundamental meaning to him. Finally, it was another round of interaction, influence, and infiltration between the two hairy embryos. In the process, the overly profound rules and doctrines that belonged to the article were probed from the theoretical level, evolving into a configuration and turning into a concrete image when the cotton candy could not reflect it in time. Eventually, in the chaotic haze, the two hairy embryos melted and turned into the Temple of Fog. Luo Nan was truly just a hairy embryo. This included the structure of the Misty Palace. Luo Nan's current visible and perceptible form mostly belonged to the intermediate state between chaos and concrete form. It was just that there were a few individuals that looked a little more gorgeous. The reason for this, aside from the difference in the depth of Luo Nan's understanding and perception, was that some external objects were mixed in as well. For example, amnesia. Luo Nan subconsciously touched his face. He was completely unable to sense any non-physical sensation. However, the strange item woven from the laminated interference spirit core was indeed still covering his face. Moreover, under Luo Nanyun's mist cover and the stimulation of his highly active soul strength, it was similarly active. From Omniscia's perspective, the floating and flowing smoke and dust of information within the haze on Luo Nan's mental plane were its nutrient. They could be used to replenish and enrich its collection. Naturally, it needed to absorb them. More importantly, in the process of absorbing nutrients, the Order of Invisible Veil, the mask behind the heavy curtains of smoke, also took the initiative to seep into the hair embryo of the Fog Palace, becoming an important element of the Fog Palace. Oh, speaking of which, the two were quite similar. They both embodied the visualization and template-based processing of certain laws of power. Speaking of which, did Liang Lu refer to Lord Zhan He's article when researching the laminated interference technique? The data presented in the database was very suspicious. Luo Nan wanted to laugh, but his heart suddenly froze. He was unable to laugh. His consciousness began to wander around the Misty Palace. It was as if he was strolling through it. One sculpture after another, either clear or blurry, flowed before his eyes. His consciousness wandered about, constantly changing angles. It was as if he had blended with the misty mist of the palace, turning into a casually wiped gauze. It was unknown where he would linger. Sometimes he would wipe that place more cleanly. Sometimes he would make it more chaotic. Among them, the clearest was the shadow cockroach. As for the reason, it was probably because he had encountered it at the end of the battle at the relay station. It had nearly taken his life, so it left a deep impression on him. Of course, it was also possible that space-time configurations were his strong suit, so he had a deeper understanding of them. However, the next one exceeded Luo Nan's expectations. In terms of clarity, it was only inferior to the shadow cockroach. It was actually the magneto-optical mica jellyfish. Its mist was chaotic and had no fixed shape. It was similar to the environment of the Misty Palace, so it should have been the hardest to distinguish. But when Luo Nan's consciousness shifted over, he had quite a few intuitive feelings towards the seemingly random changes in the structure and flow. He was often able to find the first opportunity and make a judgment that it should be like this. It seemed to be very familiar. Yes, he seemed to have been in the same situation when he took the offline exam. Later, he even borrowed the soul magnetization inside to scare away a true god. A true god. Luonan's mind anchored itself to reality when he thought of this person. He thought about the reason why he had entered this marvelous state. Originally, he just wanted to find the theoretical proof that the Pope and the true God had their eyes on the fantasy breed. How did he build a palace out of thin air? Well, this sort of thing was really more interesting. Luonan could only convince himself in this way. Then he confidently focused his attention on the misty palace. The blurry sculptures were fine for him, but the shadow cockroach and the magneto-optical mica jellyfish were so clear that they seemed to be able to be touched. Then, he could wake them up at any time. Luonan really did touch them. His target was the shadow cockroach. Luonan felt rather subtle after his telepathic contact. Of course, the shadow cockroach did not wake up. Luonan did not make contact with the material. He just had an additional understanding that pointed towards the configuration and even a deeper level. Unfortunately, it was not to the extent of being able to reproduce it. This was all just a projection of information on the mental plane. If he could create it out of thin air, wouldn't he become a master of creation? There was a transparent membrane between the transparency of ideas and the reality of matter. It could not be pierced no matter what. It was absolutely not a thin layer. It was a dimension that made one despair. Did Luonan despair? Not to that extent. He had no intention of peeking into the domain of the master of creation. He just had some thoughts. If he could pierce through this membrane, at least a bit of it would permeate through temporarily, allowing reason and reality to fuse into one. Only then could he be considered to have understood the work of the master of deep harmony. Looking at it rationally, it was impossible for Luonan to do this in a short amount of time. However, this direction and train of thought could be used. He even had ready-made tools that he could use. From the looks of things, the lamination interference technique was simply the beggar version of this high-end direction. TSK. Liang Lu, oh Liang Lu. What should I say about you? Let's first simulate it and see how your results are. Which statue to start with? As Luonan was mulling over this, the external neuron transmitted a signal that did not harmonize with the misty palace environment. It was a distant communication. This time, Luonan had no choice but to withdraw. He returned to the plane of reality, and Zhang Yingying transmitted a visual communication. Half of her pretty face was displayed, as well as the neatly stacked ice granules on a tray. Boss Luo, we're done here. Can you check and accept it? Luonan looked at his watch. Not even 2 hours had passed, and the old hands probably hadn't even finished making the mold. Not even Luonan could say anything about this efficiency. However, Luonan already had a plan for the follow-up. I sent you the assembly blueprints before. You can first assemble it according to them. Okay. Wait a moment. I'll change a few strokes first. Zhang Yingying nearly reached out and strangled Daddy Luonan, who wanted to change the plan before he could even accept it. Did he think that Her Majesty Empress Wu had outsourced the syncopation apparatus to him? Fortunately, Her Majesty Empress Wu went back to read and drink tea after she finished her work. Fortunately, Luonan had said to change a few strokes. It really didn't take too long. Very soon, the assembly blueprint was sent over again. Although Zhang Yingying curled her lips and gritted her teeth, in the end, she still worked obediently. Actually, she felt pretty good. Just as she said before, this was the first time she understood Luonan's train of thought. This meant that she had improved. Student Luonan had improved as well. It was no longer the murmur of an idiot, no longer an inhuman whisper. It had returned to a relatively clear logic, but it had a higher level of inner meaning. At least, that was how Zhang Yingying understood it. Luonan's visual communications were always on. He directed Zhang Yingying's assembly progress from a distance. Don't just use your hands. Follow up with your soul strength. Do you know telekinesis? Aren't you afraid of interference? There's still room for collaboration. Theoretically, it shouldn't be a problem for us to go in together. Hatue. Spatial structure is the most important thing. It's good to have that shape and precision, but it's fine if you don't stop. What happened? Maintain this state. And then? What's next? The sparkling and translucent ice granule structure suddenly stretched and deformed before Zhang Yingying's eyes. It was like a flying ant suddenly flapping its wings to float in the air. It even let out a buzzing sound. Hey, the frequency is too fast. Before Luonan's voice could fall, at least half of the ice syncopation apparatus exploded in midair. They transformed into a thin layer of water vapor and ice shards that assaulted Luonan's face. Zhang Yingying instinctively squinted her eyes. Her mouth cried out, "Oh no!" But when she focused her eyes to look again, a faint yet lifelike human silhouette appeared behind the water vapor. Chapter 947. You're here already? Zhang Yingying was a bit surprised. How complicated can it be? This is just a signal receiver. The power on my side is a bit higher. This side is a bit more sensitive. After connecting, I just need to make a kite string and connect them together. Luonan casually explained the basic principles. Actually, he had used this move a few months ago. Back then, he used the interference waves of the external neuron to transmit to Spring City. This time, he used the classic design of the Heavenly Yuan Empire to realize the long-distance projection, interference, and switching of mental psychic waves and electromagnetic wave. Kite flying. Zhang Yingying reluctantly accepted this explanation. But she had seen the water vapor avatar from before. Isn't it too rough? It's a bit worse than last time. Let's first solve the problem of having and not having. Then what do we do next? Accumulate advantages. Increase precision. Keep polishing. That's it. Luonan's blurry avatar lowered its head. It looked at the exploding ice shards and the disappearing water vapor. It felt a bit pained. I was a bit impatient just now. I used too much force. This syncopator is a bit brittle, but it's easy to use. What a pity. In the end, Luonan wasn't too familiar with this kite-flying method. From Zhang Yingying's point of view, Luonan's methods were already quite astonishing. A distance of several thousand kilometers and a high-speed moving target was coming as he wished. Even if there were a few prerequisites, it was no different from the legendary void shift. Using this method, the phenomenon of overloading was normal. She took the initiative to say, "I'll ask the boss to make some more for you." No need, no need. Luonan wasn't really floating. He was very clear about his own identity. I left 100 behind. Changing forms is more or less enough. Also, I want to learn Her Majesty's technique and see if I can do it myself. How else can you change? Zhang Yingying was just speaking without thinking. She didn't really care. She still wanted to provide Luonan with good conditions. Do you want me to find you a quiet place? No need. I've already found a good place. Luonan's blurry and weak outline of water vapor extended his arm and pointed at a sealed cabin wall. That's the engine room. Outside. Outside? The humidity of the air above the Pacific Ocean is quite ideal. Cloudy weather is the best. Luonan didn't wait for Zhang Yingying to react before asking, "Approximately when will we arrive?" Zhang Yingying asked, "Where?" D-City, of course. If it wasn't for you, we would have arrived long ago. If we turn around and speed up now, how about another hour and a half? That's fine. Luonan suddenly realized that Zhang Yingying's words were a bit strange. Where else could it be if not D-City? Zhang Yingying rolled her eyes at him. Look at the invitation, Luo Yuanwei. Was the auction going to be held in T-City? It was just a transit station. Actually, compared to D-City, our current location is much closer to our final destination. Then where is this? Nowhere, but less than 1,000 kilometers to the east is the Koror base. It's a satellite town of T-City and one of the most important hunting outposts in the Pacific Ocean. You mean, let me tell you something. The Jadeite Light's last stop was to get supplies there. It will leave this afternoon and head northeast. It won't stop along the way. It will take around 30 hours to travel 2,000 kilometers before it arrives at the auction's location. Luo Nan recalled the world map he had learned before. He also recalled his experience of playing hide and seek with people in the Pacific Ocean a few months ago. He was able to determine the approximate location of the Jadeite Light. The boundaries between the limited space of perception and the limitless space of imagination were blurred through complex thinking. This was originally the most common situation, but ever since the soul cloak covered the entire world, it had been a long time since he had thought about the extension of space on the scale of Earth. But when he drew the psychic diagram, he would engage in a similar thinking game. He couldn't be partial to either. Once the future was placed on the scale of interstellar space, would he still need to rely on the soul cloak to traverse the vast distance measured in light years? Luo Nan hadn't found anything similar to the soul cloak within the huge amount of information he had come into contact with. However, there were pearls and jades in the past that utilized the power of perception and imagination to carry out ingenious operations in the field of space and time. The magnetic mica jellyfish was one of them. Luo Nan subconsciously retracted his hand and caressed the blurry vapor clone. "Hey, what are you doing?" "What can I do?" Luo Nan rolled his eyes, but Zhang Yingying couldn't see it. He simply asked, "We'll reach T-City in an hour and a half. Where's the landing spot?" "Boss bought a private estate there." "Huh? Is it far from the city? Where's the specific location?" "What do you mean? Time is tight. I made some things in T-City before, like the syncopator and the like. I want to ask someone to deliver them over." "TSK, you're well prepared. Not bad. You should have told me earlier. Boss has a processing plant in T-City. We'll help you make it." Zhang Yingying suddenly realized something as she spoke. "The Blood Flame Order? Speaking of which, how did you guys hook up? Didn't they collude with Bamboo Pole's old lover, Sun Jiai, to secretly make a move against you? I remember you asking about this. But you didn't reply." The main thing is that it's too complicated." Luo Nan found it hard to use simple, easy-to-understand words to explain this process. Zhang Yingying curled her lips. "I understand. I don't pry into other people's privacy. But you can't go wrong being careful of the Black Widow." "Huh." Luo Nan's mind spun in a circle before he realized that Zhang Yingying was referring to Mrs. Halder. Zhang Yingying reached out her hand. She carried curiosity and a reminder as she stroked Luo Nan's half-incorporeal neck. She had a smile that wasn't a smile. "She's a beautiful witch." "Yes, but she's also a ruthless person who could bite off her husband's head. You don't need me to remind you of this, right?" Luo Nan thought of Mrs. Halder's various actions over the past few months and sighed from the bottom of his heart. "Yes, I've seen her." "See your ass. Rip." Zhang Yingying turned her hand and sliced across Luo Nan's neck. Unfortunately, it was still lacking in texture. So she didn't continue to dwell on this issue and waste Luo Nan's time. "The Blood Flame Order's express delivery, right? I'll talk to the estate and have them come directly." "Many thanks. Many thanks. Also, Your Majesty, help me say thank you. It's not good for me to meet people in my current state. Wait for me to dress up a bit." Luo Nan's figure vanished with a roll of watery light as he spoke. Lien. A child that lacks love. Luo Nan was no longer here, but Zhang Yingying was still very cautious. She didn't say that sensitive word. Even Luo Nan himself might not care. This was the most basic form of respect for a friend. Then Zhang Yingying walked out of the gym. She followed the corridor outside and headed toward Her Majesty Empress Wu's study. She didn't forget to contact the person in charge of the estate in T-City on the way there. She told them about the express delivery. She tilted her head after finishing the call. There was no moon tonight. The sky above the clouds of the Pacific Ocean was dense with stars. The dusky light passed through the one-sided transparent porthole, revealing to her the abundant flow of water vapor and clouds above the ocean. She was limited by her field of vision, but only a small portion of it was visible. However, Zhang Yingying had a feeling that Luonan was here purely based on her intuition. Then she saw a cloud of mist directly in front of her line of sight. It inexplicably had a clear boundary. The mist within the mist rolled and piled up. It was as if an invisible hand was patting and patting. Soon, a meaningful shape was formed. It was a smiling face shivering in the fierce winds high up in the sky. Zhang Yingying burst out in laughter. Then she stuck out her middle finger at the large face. The mist suddenly dispersed in all directions. There were no longer any traces of human activity. Her Majesty Empress Wu's airship docked with T-City's Air Traffic Control Department at around 2 o'clock in Xia City. She slowly landed in a private estate in the southern part of the city that faced the sea. The airship's engine continued to churn the air. Several well-dressed people in suits and leather shoes impatiently leaned over. They waited with their heads held high toward the newly opened cabin door. Her Majesty Empress Wu appeared at the cabin door approximately 2 minutes later. She was still wearing a long linen dress that was commonly seen in late spring and early summer. It was a perfect match for T-City's warm climate throughout the 4 seasons. She didn't wear any socks. She wore flip-flop flats as she walked down. At first glance, it looked like she had come for a summer vacation. She held a book in her hand. She flipped it open to a certain page and rolled it in her hand. Her eyelids seemed to droop, but they weren't. Her expression was leisurely and dull. She didn't feel like paying any attention to the people waiting below the ramp. It looked like she could lift the book to her eyes at any moment and enter her own world of reading. Her Majesty Empress Wu had this sort of attitude, but the people below the ramp didn't dare to treat her lightly. They all quickly came forward to welcome her. But when they actually came close, none of them dared to extend their hands. They just bowed in respect and said a few words like, "Your Majesty, it must have been hard for you to come from afar." Her Majesty Empress Wu grunted. Even the people who came forward to welcome her thought that she would directly walk over. They absolutely didn't expect that she would actually stop at the side of the ramp. "Your Majesty?" The person at the very front of the people who came to welcome her was stunned. He thought that Empress Wu had some sort of command, so he moved forward a bit. But then he saw Her Majesty Empress Wu turn her head and look up the ramp. "Hurry, hurry, hurry. The boss has already gone down." Zhang Yingying, who had already changed into casual clothes, flashed out. She strode out with her long legs and descended 4 or 5 steps down the ramp with 2-step. Then she turned around halfway. "Hey, you weren't this slow in the past. You made the boss wait for you?" I'm coming. I wasn't like this before either." A sigh rang out. Not everyone could clearly hear what was being said, but they could confirm that it was a man. Soon, the slim figure of a young man appeared above the ramp. His attire was very ordinary. He was like a middle school student that could be seen everywhere on the streets of T-City. He didn't seem too familiar with this sort of scene. He gazed into the distance and saw the deep curtain of night in T-City. He was a bit stunned. "What time is it?" T-City time is around 2 o'clock in the morning. We're currently implementing winter time, so there's a 4-hour time difference with Xia City. "What date?" "Of course it's the 15th. Right, let me remind you. The High Seas auction is on the 16th at 8 o'clock in the evening. Geographically, it's already east of the 180th parallel, but it's a pity that it hasn't crossed the sun line. It's the same as T-City in the 12th Eastern District. Time is tight." Chapter 948. It really was urgent. Luonan retracted his gaze. Only then did he see the figure on the tarmac. He locked gazes with Her Majesty Empress Wu. He didn't see Her Majesty Empress Wu again on the way here. He couldn't help but guess. Did she have something to say? He walked down the ramp and arrived beside Her Majesty Empress Wu. Zhang Yingying didn't need to say anything. She helped introduce the important figures among the welcoming staff. This is Boss's investment manager in T-City, Mr. Barty. The leader of the group of people who came to receive Luonan was fat and strong. The top of his head was shiny, but there was no hair. However, he had a lush full beard. He was neatly groomed, and his facial features were large. He wasn't handsome, but he felt like a very powerful figure. Her Majesty Empress Wu pointed at this person. Find him if you have any problems in T-City and its surroundings. I allow him to have a deficit of over 20 million every year. This is for him to be effective at times like this. Her Majesty Empress Wu didn't care about the reactions of the others. She walked forward. There was a golf cart waiting for her up ahead. Zhang Yingying thought for a bit. She winked at Luonan and followed Her Majesty Empress Wu down. Everyone naturally followed Her Majesty Empress Wu as soon as she left. Her Majesty Empress Wu and Zhang Yingying sat in the first car. Barty and Luonan fell into the second group. The car started to move forward. Barty wasn't too embarrassed. He revealed a smile to Luonan, revealing his snow-white teeth. The deficit is just an occasional phenomenon. I'm actually more proficient in long-term investments. In the foreseeable future, I can obtain generous returns. It is a great honor to meet you, Mr. Luonan. Your arrival has caused the elite traders of T-City to be jubilant. Many people want to gamble on the confidence of the market in the next 3 days to a week. Of course, there are also some people like me. They want to gamble on the future of this city and even this world. There is no need to doubt that you are this kind of person. You give us opportunities. Luonan looked at him. It sounds like I'm rolling dice on the gambling table. Barty laughed heartily. With your weight, no one would be able to move you, and no one would know when to stop. For people like us who are careless, we must find joy in suffering before we are crushed. So Luonan knew that this Mr. Barty was a very arrogant person. He displayed a bit of excessive frankness when facing a character whose strength and status were above his. In other words, he had some opinions about Luonan. Luonan had no intention of having a deep conversation with him. Just at this time, lights pierced through the darkness. Luonan looked against the headlights, and he could faintly see a flying car going up the winding mountain road of the estate. Meng Chong, the head of security for the Castle Financial Group, said he came under your orders. Oh, that's right. Meng Chong had already entered the range of Luonan's senses as they spoke. Barty said, the conditions of the Manor's reception room aren't bad. There's no need. Just wait here for him. They just so happened to pass a fork in the road. Her Majesty Empress Wu's car turned toward a certain building complex above. Luonan let the driver stop the car at the intersection. As long as Meng Chong walked along the road, he would definitely meet him here. Barty looked at his watch. That supervisor Meng would need around 1 minute to go around this winding road. This is just the beginning. Luonan felt that this bald-bearded man was a bit talkative, so he didn't say anything. He just shot a glance at Barty. Barty's smile seeped out from his thick beard. Perhaps it was because of this that there seemed to be a lot more to it. From now until the start of the high seas auction, there will be 42 hours in between. Right now, there are over 60 extraordinaries who have been confirmed to participate in the Round Table Conference. Forgive me for speaking bluntly, but you need to do some homework in order to obtain the support of over half of them. Luonan still didn't speak, but his eyebrows jumped up slightly. He heard Barty say, "You've been working in T-City for many years, managing this estate. Not only do you have professional service personnel, facilities, and a few channels. Mr. Luonan, there are some people who wish to speak with you." Some people? Luonan looked at another fork in the road. The car carrying Her Majesty Empress Wu had already disappeared into the night. Was this Her Majesty Empress Wu's intention? Luonan was silent for a few seconds. The scene of his conversation with Her Majesty Empress Wu rushed through his mind like flowing water. Then he came to a conclusion. Impossible. Her Majesty Empress Wu had clearly pointed out that Luo Nan was seriously lagging behind in his studies as a sociopath. The implication was that she didn't expect Luo Nan to be of any use in this field. Luo Nan had asked Her Majesty Empress Wu for help in making up for this shortcoming. The two sides had already discussed the conditions, even if the terms were a bit cloudy and misty. Luo Nan's gaze turned to Barty, and he determined the nature of this person. This was a broker, a very powerful broker. Her Majesty Empress Wu clearly knew this. Her general meaning was that this person would be useful, but she certainly wouldn't be following this fellow's footsteps. As for how to use this person, Luo Nan thought as he slowly shook his head. I lack confidence in my eloquence. In addition, I can't arrange my time. Barty laughed very brightly. Mr. Luo Nan, the role of professionals is to help guests like you, to make more efficient use of their time and various resources. Really? Time for experiments can be divided? This is a very unique schedule. Barty was clearly stunned for a moment, but he soon revealed a smile. But there's always a way. The illumination light streaked over, sweeping across Barty's face. Luo Nan's face was probably the same. Meng Chong arrived. The golf cart stopped at a fork in the road, and someone got out from the driver's seat. It was Meng Chong. He wore a leather jacket and jeans. His appearance was neat and tidy, and the first impression he gave others was that he was swift and fierce. He was quite in line with his status as a powerful fleshly expert. Luo Nan got off the golf cart as well. He was no stranger to Meng Chong. Even though he didn't know much about Meng Chong before, he had spent half a year fiddling with the Blood Soul Temple from time to time. He had observed and even guided the daily operation of the abyssal region's solidified configuration. In Luo Nan's eyes, Meng Chong was like a sealed furnace. The outside was already scalding, but the inside was hiding an even more fatal heat. It was a high temperature that could melt metal. Meng Chong was a dangerous person worth paying attention to. Of course, Meng Chong's feelings were different. Meng Chong's face was expressionless right now. He bowed to Luo Nan, but he didn't say anything. He was different from Mrs. Halder and Yin Lo. This was the first time he met Luo Nan and the faintly discernible Mr. Mo. He had yet to find a suitable way to interact with them. But in the end, he had to speak. After pausing for 2 seconds, he still chose to address her in the same manner as Yin Lo. Sir, the 4 base numbers for each of the 2 types are ready. Meng Chong skipped the pleasantries and went straight to the point. When he saw an outsider like Barty, he hid the word syncopator and showed his cautious and experienced side. He turned to the back of the car as he spoke. Luo Nan walked over, and Barty followed behind him as if nothing had happened. Luo Nan ignored Meng Chong. Nan did not respond, nor did he say anything. He opened the trunk, and there were 2 boxes side by side, one big and one small. Meng Chong opened the smaller one. Inside were 4 cylinders the size of an ordinary pen holder. 2 of them were made of wood, while the other 2 were made of metal. Luo Nan didn't need to open them to look. He just needed to sweep his soul strength to know that all 4 cylinders contained scintometers. It was just that the wooden cylinders were made from mutant skeletons, and the metal cylinders were made from some sort of special memory alloy. There are 200 in each cylinder. The number Meng Chong reported was quite a bit more than the base number Luo Nan needed. But this was normal. After all, there were no quality inspection standard. There was always a question of quality. Luo Nan opened one of the metal cylinders and poured out all the alloy granules within. He dangerously placed them on his palm, and then he carefully closed them. He rubbed them between his palm and fingers, emitting a slight sound. In the span of a breath, these little toys the size of rice grains seemed to come alive. Their bodies swelled, transforming into an insect-like form. There were even wing-shaped flakes on their sides that vibrated. They passed through the gaps between Luonan's fingers and returned to the cylinder. They collided with the walls of the cylinder and made rustling sounds. This continued in succession for half a minute before they could be considered to have returned to their nest. But there was a considerable portion, around 50 or so, that simply slipped through the gaps between Luonan's fingers and fell all over the ground. These were the ones that Luonan didn't have much success with in his transformation and control. They were eliminated by Luonan. The margin he left behind really did show its use. Barty and Meng Chang's gazes overcame the darkness of the night to sweep a few glances over the dark ground. The only difference was that Barty didn't make any follow-up movements. Meng Chong immediately bent down and picked up a few of the granules from the ground. He placed them in his palm, took a photo, and prepared to send it back to the processing plant for future reference and improvement. Luonan ignored the actions of the two. He picked up another cylinder and did the same thing. He tested every cylinder and eliminated 50 to 60 granules from each cylinder. One of the cylinders didn't even have enough bone materials to form a base number. The quality wasn't ideal. Compared to the Martial Emperor Sakamoto, which was still embedded in the vapor clone, the difference was quite obvious. Meng Chong could only admit his mistake when he saw this. "Sir, I'm sorry. It's nothing. It's to be expected." The difference between Earth's materials and the Heavenly Yuan empires was obvious. Plus, the standard version of the Heavenly Yuan Empire had a built-in microchip for every syncopator. It could be adjusted intelligently, reducing the burden of control by quite a bit. Luonan didn't have this condition on Earth. There were bound to be many redundant operations that exceeded the standards of the drill manual. The difficulty increased, and the requirements for the syncopata's strength and sensitivity increased. With so many restrictions, it was fine as long as it could be used. Even Her Majesty Martial Emperor's refined version had the problem of relative fragility. Luonan was quite open-minded. He tidied up the syncopator and turned his gaze to the large box to the side. He was a bit uncertain. "This is..." Deputy Ablatum Een once requested the order to collect information and resources related to the Deep Blue Walkers. Meng Chong opened the large box, revealing the silver-white components inside. "This is a military experimental machine. According to the military, it's between version 3 and 4. It was transferred through internal connections and went through the proper procedures. Currently, it's attached to the security department of the Castle Financial Group. It can connect to the private network, but there's a limit to its access. We thought that you might be able to use it in the near future, so we brought it over." Chapter 949. Thank you. Luonan did not instruct Enlo to do this. It was completely her autonomous judgment. It was quite on point. Though Luonan's water vapor avatar was no longer needed, the complicated situation that followed was that Luonan's main body could come over at any time. It was always good to have more resources to support him. "Oh, you don't need it now?" "Not necessarily." Luonan extended his hand and streaked across the ice-cold metal component. There was a clear difference between the perceptual levels of his water vapor avatar and his fleshly body. This gave him a different kind of feeling, so much so that he had some inspiration in his mind. He fell silent. He placed his fingertips on the component and gently stroked it. After a while, his gaze shifted to Meng Chong. The latter maintained a respectful and somewhat distant posture as he continued. "Also, Deputy Ritual Master Een has also sent over the design of the 4th version of the exoskeleton frame. It is currently being pushed forward, and the assembly experiment will be conducted before 8 in the morning. Sir, you can come to the processing plant for on-site guidance." "Excellent." Luonan's words were a bit casual. The exoskeleton frame was also used to build a perfect body for his main body, so it wasn't used for the time being. It could only be said that Enlo had indeed thought things through and made preparations. But right now, Luonan's train of thought had already slanted in another direction. He asked Meng Chong, The beach where Lady Halder usually trains, Meng Chong displayed clear astonishment. Clearly, he didn't understand how Luo Nan, who had just arrived in T-City, could understand Mrs. Halder's daily routine so well. But he still responded quickly. That's an unnamed private beach. We call it Zeolite. It's less than 20 kilometers away from here. Ancient Castle Financial Group's Aber Manor? Barty suddenly interrupted. If the weather is clear, from the highest castle here, which is where Her Majesty Empress Wu is currently staying, you can actually see the cliff of the orchard where your manor is located from a distance. The Zeolite beach should be on the other side of the cliff. We can already be considered neighbors. Meng Chong glanced at him but did not reply. Luo Nan's interest was piqued. Really? He really had to go and take a look. How about this? Tell Her Majesty Empress Wu that I'm going to Aber's Manor to conduct an experiment. If there's anything, she can contact me at any time. When Barty heard the word experiment again, he needed another 2 seconds to digest it. Just as he was thinking, Luo Binghe suddenly realized something. Nan had already turned to the side of the car. She pulled open the door of Meng Chong's car and sat down without hesitation. Meng Chong was also stunned. As the head of security for many years, he naturally knew what to do next. However, his meticulous thinking made him hesitate. His gaze swept across the floor once more, and Barty's eyes turned to look at him at the same time. Their gazes even met for a brief moment. Up ahead, Luo Nan had already pressed down the window. Let's go. Hurry up. Meng Chong immediately got rid of his other thoughts and roughly packed up. He closed the trunk, quickly got into the car and entered the driver's seat. A second later, the engine started. Luo Nan spoke to Barty amidst the muffled rumble. Here. Tidy things up. Barty answered quickly, of course. I mean, you still have a mission. Luo Nan spread open his palm. 7 or 8 metal or bone granules appeared on his palm. These were the granules he had intercepted before. This little thing is called a syncopator. You saw it just now. Its success rate isn't ideal. I thought that maybe the Castle Consortium's main business was in the field of sports equipment, and they weren't good at processing in this area. So, Luo Nan extended his hand out the window as he spoke. Barty subconsciously extended his hand, and Luo Nan very naturally poured the granules into Barty's hand. Ying has the blueprint. Come over and ask about it. You mean? The higher the precision of the assembly, the better. Do your best to pile up the required materials. Even so, this little thing shouldn't cost 20 million. I'm just joking. The main thing is that I can't always have Her Majesty Empress Wu do the work for me, right? Barty was stunned once more, but soon the large mouth between his whiskers cracked open. Of course, Mr. Luo Nan. I understand. I wish you success in your experiment. Thank you. Luo Nan responded politely. Then he closed the window and started the flying car. With a neat turn, he bypassed Barty and avoided the area with the most defective syncopators on the ground. He sped down the mountain. Barty stood in place, watching the car go far away. Only when the taillights of the car were submerged in the darkness did he withdraw his gaze. He looked at the little things scattered on the ground. Over 100 failed syncopators were scattered across an area of a dozen or so square meters. Even if Meng Chong's driving skills were excellent, it was hard to avoid being run over by a few. It appeared to be particularly messy. Barty's stout body slowly bent down. He extended his hand and accurately picked up 5 or 6 metal and bone granules on the ground. He copied Luo Nan and rubbed them for a bit. Nothing happened. It made sense when he thought about how these were defective product. He raised one of the granules in front of his eyes and used the illumination function of his wristband to shine a strong light on it. He observed it seriously, looking pensive. After a while, he called out to the driver of the golf cart. Pick them all up. 262, don't miss a single one. Barty didn't care what the driver's reaction was. He dialed a number and said, Clear out a material analysis laboratory. Also, ask the Coastal Defense Department for a deep blue platform experimental machine. It should be between the 3rd and 4th edition. A call came in while Barty was still giving out orders. He glanced at the caller ID. It was labeled with the nickname Red Eye Yen. Barty ignored it and continued to order. Also, those professionals who call themselves configuration experts. It's time for them to show their value. The number in the middle called again. Barty was very patient. He arranged the tasks of analyzing the syncopators in every detail. Then he organized his thoughts and confirmed that he didn't miss anything. Only then did he select the number and call back. Director Yen. Barty had just started when the words that had been bottled up for several minutes gushed out. What the hell is that little bastard of the Luo family up to? Barty stroked his neatly trimmed beard. He came. He left. He arranged tasks. He increased my work. That's it. He arranged for you. Her Majesty Empress Wu introduced me to him in a grand manner. Clearly, she wants my ability to match this grand. So I prepared a few meetings and a few messages. But Mr. Luo doesn't seem to be interested in any of this. Perhaps I should have made it clear earlier. This includes you. Don't beat around the bush, Barty. We found you and paid you. We want to receive the reward we deserve. Yes, this is in line with the spirit of the contract. But for the sake of fairness, before the transaction, there should be a valuation, right? Barty looked at his watch. It's 2:17 in the morning now. In another 6 hours we can talk about the next step of the transaction. Of course, if you can't wait, you can come to the Bitter Reef Laboratory earlier. I'll be there. Remember to bring your professionals in every sense of the word.